When 8 billion of us woke on top of a drowned city that climbed a mile out of a black dead sea, the system handed most people a working weapon and handed me a talent the whole survivor network laughed at, because all it did was repair broken junk. They called me the junk man before I had moved a single step. What none of them understood was that a sunken world is nothing but broken things. That my system did not merely fix what it touched, but restored it one tier beyond what it had ever been. The only way off the flooding spire was down, toward whatever had broken the world on purpose. So I let them laugh. I hid how strong the rubble made me, and I began to descend. The first thing I felt was the water, cold around my ankles, and rising while a sky the color of a bruise pressed down on a tier of broken towers that ran out flat toward a horizon, with no land on it. 10,000 of us had surfaced on this top tier of the spire, and the ones nearest me were already screaming about where they were, clutching whatever they had been handed, turning in circles on a flooded plaza of cracked concrete and rusted railing. The whole tier had once been the crown of some enormous building now sunk to its neck in dead ocean. That ruin was the first thing my eyes wanted to read while everyone else's wanted only a way out. I did not scream. Panic had never once fixed a broken thing in my life, and the world around me was nothing but broken things waiting to be read. The drowned spire net opened over the inside of my vision before I had taken a full breath, and it told me the rules in a voice that had no person behind it, only the flat certainty of a thing that had done this many times before. Every cycle the spire would flood higher. It said, so I would descend through its interior layers or I would drown with the surface. And I was to appraise before I touched anything, because the deeper layers held salvage that could kill a careless hand before it ever closed. A population counter hung at the top corner of everything I looked at, and it read 10,000 on this tier and 8 billion across the whole spire. As I watched it, the 8 billion ticked down by 100, then 100 more. The dead were already starting somewhere below me. My starter kit weighed almost nothing. I understood that the moment I looked at the two things I had been given. The first was a single rusted multi-tool, a folding thing of pitted steel that a previous owner had clearly drowned and abandoned, and the second was the Menforge system itself, which surfaced its own description across my sight when I focused on it. At the engine of it sat a talent called Restore, which would repair any broken object, structure, or dead creature, returning that thing not to working order but to one tier above the best it had ever been. A second talent rode alongside it, the Appraisal Eye, which would read the true history, danger, and weak point of anything before my hand ever met it, and which, the system noted in a line it gave no special weight to, concealed my own stats from the appraisal of every other survivor on the spire. I had read perhaps half of it when the net decided what I was, because the public layer let any survivor appraise any other in plain view, and someone near me had appraised my kit and laughed loud enough that the laugh spread before I could close the description. A man 6 steps away with a working assault rifle slung across his chest pointed at me and told the whole plaza that the system had handed the apocalypse a janitor. The name Junkman went out across the net to 10,000 people in the space of a breath, a tag I had no way to peel off. I let it stay there. A man who can turn rubble into weapons is a target the moment anyone understands him, and being understood was the one luxury I could not afford on a spire where the 8 billion was already 900,000 lighter than it had been a minute ago. The survivors with working gear were already organizing into the loud, confident clusters that always form around whoever is armed, and the survivors without it were learning the second oldest lesson of any disaster, which is that the people with the guns will decide who eats. I stepped back out of the worst of it, toward the flooded edge of the plaza, where the rubble was thickest, and nobody else wanted to be, because the rubble was exactly where my eyes worked and theirs did not. The water there was past my shins and climbing, full of the broken furniture of a drowned world. Under a slab of fallen railing, my appraisal eye caught something that made me crouch down into the cold without a second thought. It was a blade, or it had been, a service knife snapped clean through the middle and rusted until the two halves were the same dead orange as everything else down here. My appraisal eye opened its history before my fingers ever touched it, telling me the whole sad life of the thing in a single quiet pour of knowing. This knife had been forged twice and failed twice, reforged after its first break by a smith who cut a corner on the temper and snapped again the day the water came. The weak point was the old re-weld at the spine. The danger was nothing. The value was almost nothing. To every other survivor on this tier, it was a piece of garbage not worth the bending to pick up. I picked it up, and I felt the Restore gather behind my eyes the way it would come to feel 1,000 times after. A pressure that was also a question, asking how far above the thing's old peak I wanted to push it, and what it would cost me. There was a resource named Men Charge, a small reservoir of it in me that this first restoration would barely dent, and I spent what the broken knife needed and watched the talent close over the 2 rusted halves in my palm. The rust lifted off the steel and fell away as black flakes onto the rising water, while the snapped break drew itself shut without a seam. Metal came back not to what it had been, but past it. A clean gray edge carried a faint blue line of temper down its spine that no smith in the old world had ever managed to lay into it. That restored knife sat in my hand sharper than it had ever been forged. In that single held breath, I understood exactly what I had been given, and exactly why I was going to hide it. Around me, 1,000 survivors fought over the handful of intact weapons scattered across the plaza, while I stood ankle-deep in an entire dead world of broken things that my hands could turn into something better than anyone up here was carrying. The math arranged itself with the cold clarity I usually only felt over a workbench. They were all fighting over a pile that could only shrink, and I had stumbled onto an infinite supply that every one of them was standing on and calling garbage. I did not get long to admire the knife. The first swarm came out of the flooded stairwells, while the armed clusters were still arguing about who was in charge. They poured up from below in a gray-brown tide, drowned rats as big as dogs, with the wrong number of joints in their legs, and a slick of black water running off their backs. My appraisal eye read them in a wash before they reached me, every weak point laid open, the soft seam under the jaw where the spine ran shallow. The plaza dissolved into screaming and gunfire, the men with rifles spending bullets they would never get back on a swarm that did not care. 3 of the things broke off the main tide and came straight at the lone unarmed janitor at the edge of the water. That restored blade did what no rusted scrap had any business doing, going through the first rat's jaw seam and out the back of its skull on a draw I barely had to lean into, the edge meaning nothing it could not part. I took the second one across the same line before it finished its leap. The third I let close until its own weight carried it onto the point, and then I stepped back into the rubble with 3 dead things sinking into the flood at my feet, and a knife that had not so much as chipped. Nobody had watched me do it. Everyone with eyes was busy keeping their own throat, and the net was a wall of panic and gunfire reports that buried one unarmed man's 3 quiet kills under 1,000 louder deaths. That anonymity was the second gift the day had handed me, worth almost as much as the blade, because a survivor whose kills go unwatched is a survivor nobody adds to the list of people worth robbing. I crouched in the wreckage while the swarm thinned, and read the net the way I would come to read it every cycle after. Not for the panic everyone else was drowning in, but for the shape of the thing underneath. The prices and the boasts surfaced first, and under them ran the slow, cruel sorting of 10,000 strangers, into the ones who would take and the ones who would be taken. Up on the dry stone, the armed clusters were already trading threats over the corpses, the men with the most working guns claiming the high ground and the right to tax whoever wanted to stand on it. On the trade channel, survivors were posting their first desperate offers, the ones who had understood within the hour that the system had not handed them a fair start. I marked the loudest of the armed men, filed the choke points of the flooding plaza, and let the wreckage tell me which of its drowned bones would answer my hands first when I had the charge to spend. A man who plans while others panic is a man still alive when the panic runs out. Once the swarm was spent, I cleaned the blade on my own sleeve and folded it away while the armed clusters were still burning ammunition on the last of the swarm. I let the net go on calling me the junk man, because the name was the best armor I had been handed all day. The population counter had fallen by another 40,000 while the rats came through, and I stood at the flooded edge of the tier doing the only thing I trusted myself to do, which was watch, count, and read. Water that had been at my shins when I woke was now past my knees, climbing the rubble faster than my eyes wanted to believe. I pulled up the net's own posting of the flood schedule and held that number against what the rising line was actually doing on the concrete in front of me. The two did not agree. Water was coming up faster than the system had promised, and I was the only one on the tier who had stopped screaming long enough to notice it. I had moved maybe 20 steps along the flooded edge, salvaging what my eyes told me was worth the wait, when a woman in a salvager's harness stopped in front of me and looked at the place on my belt, where the folded knife rode. She was oil-stained to the elbow on the one arm she still had, and the other ended in a blunt wrist where a prosthetic should have been, the kind of clean loss that comes from a thing being torn off rather than cut. What she told me was that she had heard the blade come off the rubble. Broken metal does not sing when it parts a skull, and that one had sung, and she wanted to know what a janitor had done to a piece of garbage to make it cut like that. I gave her the answer that cost me nothing, which was that I had gotten lucky with a sharp scrap, and she answered flatly that she raided salvage for a living and had never once gotten lucky with a snapped service knife. Her name was Han Soyeon, she said, and before the transport she had been a salvage engineer who could tell the grade of a steel by the sound it made when it failed, which was how she knew the thing on my belt had failed, and then become something that did not fail at all. She was not threatening me, which I noted, nor was she posting me anywhere public, which I noted harder. A woman who had clocked exactly what I could do and kept it to herself was either the most dangerous person on the tier or the most useful, and I was about to find out which. Suyeon held up the blunt wrist and named the price of her silence in the same breath she named the thing she wanted, which was the hand the transport had ripped off her along with her old life. She had carried the dead prosthetic up onto the spire in her harness, a ruined piece of servo and casing that no working survivor would waste a thought on. The dead prosthetic went into my one free hand, and she watched my face while I let the appraisal eye open it. Its history poured in, a good machine drowned and crushed, the actuators seized, the control board cracked, a thing 3 tiers below anything that would ever grip again by the ordinary rules of this dead world, which were not the rules I worked by. I told her the truth was worth more than she could pay me yet, and that I would trade her the restored hand for her silence instead of the answer. And she agreed before I finished saying it. The restore took more men charged than the knife had, enough that I felt the reservoir drop, and felt the cost land somewhere behind my sternum, and I spent it watching the dead prosthetic remake itself in my palm. A cracked board sealed while the seized actuators came loose and then came back tighter than they had ever moved, and the casing closed over a hand that was not the one she had lost, but a tier above it, quicker, stronger, reading nerve signal cleaner than the old one ever had. She socketed it onto her wrist and flexed it, and the fingers closed with a precision that made her go very still. Then, quietly, she told me that this was better than the hand she was born with. She did not thank me, which I respected, because thanks are cheap and she paid in something that was not. Suyeon told me she would say nothing to anyone about what I was, that she would find me rubble worth restoring faster than I could find it myself, and that she expected a cut of whatever the two of us pulled out of this drowning world. I agreed to fair shares and steep terms for anyone who was not her. We shook on it with the hand I had just built, and that was how I gained the first person on the spire who knew what I was, and the first I did not have to hide from. The two of us worked the dying top tier together while the rest of the survivors burned through their advantages around us. Up on the dry stone, the armed clusters had finished the rat swarm and turned, as armed clusters always do, to the business of taking from the unarmed. A hierarchy was forming on the plaza in real time, the men with rifles taxing the men without them for the right to stand on flooding concrete. Suyeon and I stayed at the rubble edge where nobody with a gun saw any profit. She raided the broken things faster than I could have alone, pointing me to a cracked power cell here and a snapped brace there. Every piece of it jumped to the eyes that were busy fighting over the few intact weapons up on the dry stone. What she had that the armed men did not was the ability to look at a drowned ruin and hear what it used to be, the grate of a steel and the sound it made when she flexed it, the shape of a machine and the way its dead parts sat. She fed me a stream of targets faster than my hands could keep up with. I restored a cracked power cell back past full and felt it sit warm and heavy with charge it had never held when new, then brought a snapped bracket back as a clamp that would hold a wall together under pressure the original would have torn loose under. We stacked the finished pieces in a drowned shop bay while the plaza behind us thinned of the living. The two of us had fallen into a rhythm by the time the water reached my thighs. Her ear and my hands working a dead world neither of us could have worked alone. For the first time since I surfaced, I was not a man surviving a disaster, but a man with a supply line. On a drowning spire, that was the difference between dying soon and dying last. The exponent of the thing sat in my head as a number I kept turning over while we worked. Up on the dry concrete, 100 armed survivors were dividing a pile of working gear that could only ever get smaller. Every shot they fired and every kit they broke, subtracting from a total nothing on this dead spire would ever add to. Down in the water where Suyeon and I crouched, the supply did not shrink, because the supply was the ruin itself. The entire drowned world of snapped, rusted, crushed things that my hands turned a tier above knew, while every armed man on the tier walked past it, calling it trash. They were fighting over what was running out. I was standing waist deep in what would never run out, and the only thing keeping that truth from getting me killed was that not one of them could see it. The flood settled the question of how long we had to enjoy the arrangement, because the water came up a full cycle early. A schedule had been posted on the net, a promise that the surface would hold until the next mark before it climbed again, and the surface broke that promise by a hand's width, and then another while I watched the line crawl up the rubble. The population counter answered it before the survivors did, the 8 billion shedding numbers faster than it had all day, as the deep layers drowned the careless. Panic came up through the net as a solid wall. 10,000 people on this tier alone realized at once that the floor they stood on was about to be the sea. Suyeon read it off my face before I said anything, and she pointed out that there was exactly one way off a tier that was going under, which was the descent shaft, and that the descent shaft was already a problem. A man named Castle Dorn had reached it first, she said, with enough working guns behind him to make the only door off a drowning floor into a toll booth, and Dorn had already posted his rate for everyone to read while they realized they had no choice but to pay it. Most survivors would pay in working gear, the rifles and kits that bought a place in the new hierarchy, and a few would pay in worse than that. The public layer was already thick with the bidding of people who had just understood that the man at the shaft owned their lives. I held the net open as we waited the last of the plaza, reading the panic for what it was hiding rather than what it was shouting. The descent rank board had only just begun to populate, a leaderboard the system meant to measure how far each survivor had pushed down the spire. And at this early hour, almost every name on it sat at 0, because almost no one had gone down at all. Dorn's name rode near the top of the tier board, for the simple reason that he had claimed the door rather than descended through it, a rank built on owning the way down instead of taking it. I marked that as the second weak point under the first. The trade channel scrolled with survivors offering working rifles for a single passage, a kit and a coat for a place in the line, and one man somewhere on the tier offering everything he had been given for the bare promise of not drowning. Those prices told me exactly how badly the early flood had broken the nerve of 10,000 people who had woken that morning thinking the schedule would protect them. I pulled the public layer up and read Dorn's posting the way I read a broken machine, looking for the weak point under the surface. And the weak point was that Dorn thought the shaft was the only thing of value on a tier full of garbage. He was right that it was the only way down, and he was wrong about everything else. I filed that gap away while we moved. The water was at my waist now, and climbing the rubble in a way the schedule still insisted it should not, the counter-bleeding numbers in the corner of my eye. Suyeon stayed at my shoulder with the hand I had built her flexing slow and easy as we crossed the drowning plaza, toward the only door out of it. Dorn's racket had the shaft exactly the way Suyeon had said, a ring of armed men standing on the last dry stone of the tier with the dark mouth of the descent behind them and a line of desperate survivors stripping off their gear to pay the toll. Dorn himself was easy to find, a heavy man with 2 working rifles he was not carrying because 3 of his crew were carrying them for him. He watched the line pay with the patient pleasure of a man who has found the one choke point in a disaster and means to own it. When I came up out of the rising water and my salvagers ragged with no weapon any of them could see, his face opened into the smile I had been collecting on the net all day, the one that came free with a name. Across the whetstone he called for the junkman to come pay the toll, like everyone else. Then he asked, to the laughter of his crew, what a trash picker could possibly have that was worth the price of not drowning, with the black water already climbing my back and the only way down standing behind his guns. I walked up to Dorn's line with my hands open and empty, because a beaten posture talks its way past guns that a dangerous one only has to fight. He let one of his men appraise me first, the standard move sending one of them with the public layer read to scan whatever I was carrying before they decided what to charge me. And I let that man look at me as long as he wanted. The auto-hide did exactly what the system had promised it would. It returned nothing to the man scanning me. An empty read with no stats, no talent worth naming, a survivor who showed as the lowest rung of nobody on the spire. He reported back to Dorn that the junkman had a rusted multi-tool and a pocket knife, and not one thing else worth the toll. Dorn, who priced everything by what his crew could see, decided the cheapest way to clear me off his door was to take the knife and the tool and let me pass for nothing. That suited me exactly, because the rusted multi-tool was the only thing I would ever willingly hand a man like Dorn, and the restored knife had already gone up Suyeon's sleeve, while the racket was laughing at my empty appraisal. I gave Dorn the multi-tool, paid a toll the whole line could see was an insult, and stepped past his guns into the dark mouth of the descent shaft with Suyeon a step behind me, the 2 of us costing him nothing and reading as less. He called something after us about the junkman going down to die in the deep where his trash could not save him, and I carried it down into the shaft as one more thing I would collect on later. The water closed over the lip of the tier behind us as we went. Above us, the top of the spire finished its long surrender to the sea, while we dropped below it. That descent shaft fed us down through a wet vertical throat of broken stairwell and dead elevator for a long cold while as the light failed, and then it opened out and dropped us into the drowned concourse. A name for the place reached me through the net before my eyes adjusted, a layer the survivor maps tagged as the first great interior level of the spire, and what it had been was a market, an enormous flooded mall concourse that ran away in every direction under a ceiling, lost in the dark. Drowned shopfronts lined the long flooded avenues, their signage rotted to ghosts, their windows blown in by the pressure of the water that stood waist deep down the middle of every walkway and deeper in the sunken bays. To every survivor splashing down into it, the concourse was a graveyard of dead stores. In my eyes, it was the richest single room I had ever stood in, a horizon of broken things in every direction, each one a thing my hands could lift a tier above what it had been. Suyeon read the place by ear and instinct the moment we landed, telling me which of the dead shopfronts had been hardware and which had been soft, where the metal would have settled and where the rot would have eaten everything worth taking. We worked the near avenue first while other survivors poured down the shaft behind us and scattered into the dark in a panic of grabbing. And the difference between how they salvaged and how we did was the whole story of the spire in miniature. They went for the few intact things, the sealed cases and the unbroken stock, and they fought each other for those scarce working remnants while walking straight past the rubble that was every bit as good in my hands and worth nothing in theirs. I read a snapped pry bar out of a flooded tool shop and restored it into something that bit into a jammed security shutter and folded it over. Behind that shutter was a stock room 3 other crews had already given up on, because the door had beaten them. There was a system to caches on the concourse. The net had mapped it. Salvage stores the spire seeded through its layers and tiers as survivor learned to read fast or die poor. The lowest were the rust caches, common things full of scrap and dead batteries and a stray common core. And the next were the iron caches, rarer, holding restorable weapons, tools, and now and then a blueprint worth more than the steel. To most ascenders, a rust cache was barely worth the swim, a box of garbage the system had insulted them with. And to me, a rust cache was a full meal, every dead battery a thing my restore could bring back past full, and every piece of scrap a weapon waiting to be read. We cleared 2 rust caches and an iron in the first stretch of avenue while the armed crews were still fighting over a single sealed weapons case 3 shop fronts down. Suyeon kept a running count of what we pulled that climbed faster than either of us said out loud. The concourse, it turned out, was already Dorn's the way the shaft had been his, because whoever owns the only door owns everything that walks through it. His racket had come down ahead of the flood with the working guns to enforce it, and his crew taxed every salvager on the layer the same way they had taxed the line above. A cut of every haul for the right to keep breathing while you took it. They were working the avenues in armed pairs, stopping survivors who had pulled anything worth taking, and Dorn's posting of the new rate went up the same hour we landed. He had never connected the harmless trash picker he fleeced upstairs to the salvager quietly clearing caches 3 avenues over. In Dorn's read of the world, the junkman was already behind him, fleeced and forgotten, probably drowned. I let him keep that read while I went to work on him through the only channel he respected, which was the trade market on the net. Dorn ran the concourse market the way he ran everything, buying salvage off frightened survivors at a fraction of its worth, and reselling it up the line at a markup. And the whole racket rested on his crew being the only ones with enough surplus to set the prices. I came into that market as a nobody salvager with a name people laughed at and a stock of goods that should not have existed. Restored tools and weapons a tier above anything Dorn's crew was reselling. Priced just under his. Offered quietly to the survivors he was bleeding. A descender who could buy a restored blade from me for less than Dorn charged for a chipped one did the math in a heartbeat. The trade started bleeding off Dorn's market toward mine faster than he understood. Because the goods were better, the price was lower, and the seller was the survivor he had written off as dead. Those trades themselves were the part I enjoyed. Each one a small surgery on a man who thought he was the predator in every room. A descender would come to me with a working rifle he was desperate to keep, and a broken second one he meant to throw away. I would offer to take the broken one off his hands and hand back a restored blade worth 3 of the rifle he was clutching, and he would walk away certain he had fleeced the simple junk man out of a treasure. He had given me garbage and a thanks for taking it, and I had given him something a tier above what Dorn sold at 4 times the price. Both of us left the trade convinced we had won, except only one of us was right. I built my stock that way all through the layer, taking the broken things survivors were ashamed to be seen carrying, and returning gear good enough that they started seeking me out. Every one of those trades widened the gap between what I could offer and what Dorn could, and each cost me nothing but charge I would regenerate by the next cycle. My favorite part, the one I enjoyed more than I should have, was that Dorn could not see where my stock came from. To his eyes and his crew's appraisals, I was buying garbage off the layer at scrap prices and reselling finished gear at a profit that made no sense. A margin that looked like either a miracle or a swindle. Any operator who runs every con on a layer assumes the one thing he cannot explain must be a bigger con than his. He started buying up the cheap rubble himself to choke my supply, paying real prices for snapped blades and dead cells he thought I needed, which meant he was spending his surplus to corner a market in exactly the worthless trash my whole advantage was built on. Every cache of junk Dorn hoarded to starve me was a cache I no longer had to swim for. Suyeon laughed, the first real laugh I had heard from her when she worked out that the racket was now buying our raw material for us. My descent rank had begun to move while all of this happened, quietly, the way I wanted everything about me to move. The system measured rank by how far and how well a survivor pushed down through the layers. Salvage cleared, caches taken, ground held, and mine climbed off the bottom and kept climbing while the name attached to it stayed the joke it had been at the top. On the concourse board, the junk man sat well up among the descenders who had landed when I had, higher than men with 3 working rifles and a full crew. Not one of them looked twice at it because the name told them it had to be a glitch. Dorn's own rank had stalled, because owning a door is not descending, and the gap between someone who taxes a layer and someone who takes it was opening on the board in numbers anyone could read if they bothered. Nobody bothered to read a trash picker. Dorn worked it out slower than his market did, but he worked it out. Slow as someone who notices the floor is wet only after his shoes have been soaked for an hour. His crew brought him the accounting, the trade bleeding to a rival, the rubble prices climbing for no reason, the cheap restored gear flooding the layer from a source his appraisers could not find. A survivor somewhere finally said the name out loud and connected the trash picker from upstairs to the cellar eating his market. I watched the shift come through the net the same way I had watched the flood come up the rubble. The public layer carrying Dorn's mood from contempt into something harder as his posts went from mockery to warning. Then the warning stopped being words. Suyeon caught it the same moment I did. A knot of Dorn's armed crew breaking off the avenues and moving toward the bay where our haul was stacked. They were no longer interested in taxing my salvage. Now they were coming to take all of it, with Dorn's order out across the layer to bring back everything the trash picker had and the trash picker with it. I had been waiting for Dorn to send his crew, because a threat you can see coming is a threat you get to choose the ground for, and I had chosen the ground 3 avenues back before he ever gave the order. The bay where Suyeon and I had stacked our haul was a dead concourse block, a corner of the market a city built and then drowned. 4 collapsed shop fronts around a flooded plaza with one wide mouth and no other way in that a man in armor could use. To Dorn's crew it read as a cornered animal's den, a place the trash picker had backed himself into with his loot. That read was exactly the one I had built it to give, while I spent a pair of cycles of salvage turning the dead block into the first thing I ever held. The restore does to a building what it does to a blade, which is bring it back past what it was, and I had been running it on that block in pieces while the racket was busy losing its market to me. I restored a dead power line that ran under the plaza, and the corner drank current for the first time since the flood, lights coming up green in the drowned shop fronts that had been dark since the world went under. Next went the collapsed front of the corner store, restored into a wall, the rubble drawing itself up into fitted stone a tier denser than it had ever been poured. The bent security shutter at the bay's mouth came back as a gate that ran on the power I had just fed the place. All of it cost real men charge, the reservoir running low enough that I felt the floor of it, and I spent the last of it on the things that mattered most, which were the traps. Every survivor on the concourse who walked past a snapped pressure plate or a burnt alarm relay saw garbage, and my appraisal eye saw a working defense grid waiting to be brought back a tier above what the mall had ever protected itself with. I salvaged the bones of the old store's security out of the rubble and restored the pressure plates under the plaza's standing water, where no one could see them. The restored relays wired into the gate and the lights, so that the dead block was not a den at all but a machine that knew the moment anyone stepped wrong inside it. Suyeon walked the finished bay and went quiet. As quiet as she had gone over the hand, she told me she had spent her whole career raiding other people's strongholds, and had never raided one built out of the exact trash everyone else swam past, by a man the whole layer still called a janitor. Dorn's crew came in the wide mouth of the bay confident, 8 of them with working rifles and the easy posture of men who had never once been the ones outgunned. They came for a trash picker and his stacked loot, and they did not appraise the bay on the way in because nothing in their world was worth appraising about a drowned concourse corner. That was the whole of the trap. They could not see a fortress built from what they had been trained their entire lives to ignore. The gate dropped behind them on the restored power. The instant the last man cleared the mouth, the standing water lit up where the pressure plates read their weight, and the corner I had spent 2 cycles building came alive around 8 men who had walked into it certain they were the dangerous ones in the room. I did not have to kill them, which mattered, because a killed crew is a grudge, and a broken one is a lesson the rest of the layer reads on the net. The relays dropped the gate, killed the footing under them with the current the standing water carried, and folded the bay's restored walls inward at the choke I had built for exactly this. Dorn's 8 went down into the flooded plaza, tangled, shocked, and disarmed, before half of them understood the den had teeth. Suyeon and I took their rifles while they were still finding the floor, and I left them their lives and nothing else. 8 armed men reduced to 8 wet survivors who would carry the story of the Junkman's block up the avenues faster than any post I could have written. One of them, while I bound his hands with restored cable, finally did the thing none of them had done coming in, and let his appraisal open on the block around him. I watched his face do the math the layer had refused to do all day. The read coming back on walls a tier above poured stone, on a gate running clean power in a drowned dead world, on a defense grid built from the snapped and rusted nothing his own crew had been swimming past since they landed. With the flat horror of a man who has just understood the size of his mistake, he told me the Junkman had outgeared Dorn's entire racket from the trash they had spent the day taxing other people for, that every wall and every trap was the exact garbage they had stepped over to chase a few intact rifles. I let him keep that understanding. A witness who has seen the truth and lived is worth more to me on the net than a corpse, and I sent all 8 of them back up the avenues to tell it. The net turned that hour, all at once and without apology, and I read it turned the same as I had read everything since the plaza. Dorn had posted the Junkman as a joke since the shaft a running bit his crew and his market had all laughed along with. Now the descent rank board sat there in plain public view, with that same Junkman holding a place on the concourse that put him top 50 on the whole layer, above Dorn, above every armed crew that had taxed its way through the market. The survivors Dorn had bled came to my market openly now instead of in the dark, the mockery in the trade channel curdling into something closer to calculation, as 10,000 frightened people recalculated who on this layer was actually worth being near. That name, Junkman, did not die, but it changed under them, the laugh draining out of it until it was just a word people used for the one salvager on the concourse who could turn their worst day into a weapon. I let it keep changing. A reputation I controlled was worth more than a name I cleared. The exponent of the thing showed plainest in the hour after the block came alive, when survivors who had walked the same drowned avenues I had came to trade and saw what the difference had bought. A rival crew 3 bays over had spent the same 2 cycles I had fighting other survivors for a single sealed weapons case and a generator that no longer ran, and at the end of it they had a locked box they could not open, and a dead machine none of them could fix. In the same span, off the exact rubble they had waded past to reach their case, I had raised a lit block with power, walls, a gate, and a buried defense grid. The only material difference between their day and mine was that I could use what was broken and they could only fight over what was not. A survivor who came to my gate to trade did that math out loud while he stood in the green light. He told Suyeon he had watched 3 crews bleed each other dry over scraps, while the Junkman quietly built the only working stronghold on the layer out of the garbage all 3 crews had thrown at his feet. I let him say it. The truth coming out of a stranger's mouth was worth more than any boast I could have posted myself, and every survivor who heard it understood a little better that the man to be near on a dead spire was the one who had never needed the things they were killing each other for. Dorn himself I left broken and useful, which was a deliberate choice and not a mercy. I could have taken his market and his crew and his place at the shaft and finished him, and a finished Dorn is a dead asset, where a broken one is a man who now owes his survival to the restraint of the survivor he tried to rob. Through the market I sent him a private trade offer while his crew was still wringing out their clothes. Terms that let him keep a fraction of his racket in exchange for funneling every scrap of concourse rubble he controlled to me at a price that made him my supplier. Dorn understood leverage better than he understood anything. He took the deal because the alternative was nothing. The scammer who had owned the door became the man who swept the trash for the trash picker, and the layer watched it happen on the board and learned the lesson without my having to teach it twice. Old Marin found me the morning after, or what passed for morning on a layer the sun never reached, a half-blind salvager who had survived the first cycles when most of the spire had not. She came to my block without a weapon and without fear, an old woman with one milky eye and one sharp one. Standing in the lit mouth of my restored gate, she looked at the walls much as Suyeon had, except she was not rating them but remembering them. Years ago she had walked this concourse, she said, when it was a market and not a tomb. She knew the difference between a building a survivor had patched to working and one that had been made more than it was, and she told me the spire remembered what it had been, every layer of it, all the way down. When I asked her what she meant, she only said that anyone who could make ruins remember would be wanted very badly by the things that had worked so hard to make this world forget. Then she would not say another word about it, and left me holding the first thread of a thing I did not yet have a shape for. I turned what old Marin had said over while Suyeon and I catalogued the hall, because a warning from a survivor who had lived through the first cycles was worth more than any reading my eye could pull off a wall. She had not feared my gait or my power the way the armed crews did, and she had not wanted to trade for any of it, which made her the first person on the layer whose interest in me I could not price. What stayed with me was the word she had chosen, that the things which sank this world had worked to make it forget. A flood that drowns a city is a disaster, while a flood meant to make a world forget what it had been is something with a purpose and a hand behind it. I had spent the whole day reading the spire as a problem of salvage and survival, a dead place full of broken things my hands could lift, and Marin had sat down beside that reading the first hint that the dead place was not an accident at all. So I filed it the same as I filed everything, a weak point in my understanding of the board I was playing on, and I promised myself I would pull the rest of it out of the old woman when she decided I had earned it. That night, the block told me about the sublevel in the only language a restored thing speaks, which is the language of the sensors I had brought back to life under its floors. The restored defense grid that watched the plaza was reading deeper than I had built it to read, picking up movement below the concourse where my maps showed only sealed dead structure, a slow patient stirring under the drowned market that the spire's own layers were supposed to have closed off. Suyeon felt me go still over the readout and asked what the grid had found, and I told her the truth, that something was moving in a place the survivor maps swore was sealed, directly beneath the block I had just bled so much charge to hold. The water was still rising on the concourse, a hand's width every cycle the way it had on the tier above. Whatever was stirring in the sealed dark below us was the only thing on the layer moving toward me instead of away from the flood. Suyeon and I went down after the thing the grid had found, because a stronghold that cannot tell you what is under its own floor is not a stronghold worth keeping. The sealed sublevel sat below the market, where the survivor map showed only closed dead structure, and the only way to reach it was a maintenance throat behind the drowned shop fronts that the flood had not yet filled. A black wet shaft my restored grid had read movement at the bottom of. We went down it together, Suyeon with the restored cutting torch I had built her and the breather it fed, me with the blade and my reed opened the whole descent, working the black for danger before it could find us. Suyeon had argued for leaving the sublevel sealed and holding the block until the flood forced our hand. I told her the truth that changed her mind, that a threat you choose to meet is a threat you fight on your own ground, while a threat you wait for is one that picks the moment you are weakest. She had been a salvage engineer long enough to know the cost of ignoring a reading, and she came down the throat behind me without another word of argument, the restored hand finding holes in the wet stone that her old one never could have closed on. Going down below my own stronghold was the first time since the plaza that I felt the size of what the descent actually was. It was not a single drop down a single shaft, but a whole spire of them, each layer hiding a worse one under it, all the way to whatever waited at the root. The sublevel opened into a flooded service hollow under the market, low, close, older than the market above it, the bones of the spire showing through where the newer construction stopped. My appraisal eye worked the place over before my feet had settled, and what it found was not a creature at all but a structure, a sealed descent shaft built into the bedrock of it, and capped a long time ago by something that did not want it opened. The history poured into me off the rusted metal. It told me where the shaft went, down past the market into a layer the maps named the transit tombs, a drowned web of collapsed transit tunnels deeper, older, far worse than anything I had walked yet. That movement the grid had read was the seal itself failing, a slow patient working of the cap as the rising water pressed it from below, and I understood standing there that the rising water was not only climbing the spire but feeding up through its roots. Suyeon ran her restored hand along the old cap and told me what her ear told her. That the seal had held for longer than either of us had been alive, and was a season from giving way, and that whatever was on the other side of it was old enough to have been sealed away on purpose. We did not open it yet. There was a thing in the hollow my eyes had already marked, a cache the system had buried down here a tier above anything I had touched on the concourse, and a man does not walk past a locked reward to go open a worse door first. The cache read is brass on the system's ladder, 2 tiers above the rust and iron stores I had been clearing all day, and brass was where salvage stopped being scrap and started being the thing that changed what a survivor could do. My appraisal eye opened it before I cracked the lid, so I knew the contents before my hands confirmed them. Inside sat the first real upgrade this dead world had ever offered me. There was a schematic, a restorable plan for a defense, construct a vanished world had built, and the rising water had killed, a warframe I could raise off the rubble of my own block once I had the charge for it. My read of it walked me through what the construct had been before its death, a sentry platform that had guarded this service hollow against the very kind of intrusion my grid had read, and it told me that restored a tier above its peak the thing would answer to no one but the hand that brought it back. Better than the schematic were the cores, 3 of them. Rare salvaged cores of the grade the system needed for the deep restorations I had not yet been able to afford. Each core read in my sight as a small dense knot of the old world's power, the kind of thing the survivor maps marked in red and warned descenders not to die reaching for. I held all 3 in my palm at once while Suyeon counted them off and went quiet at the number. All day I had felt the ceiling of my own resource, the men charge that capped how much I could lift per cycle and forced me to choose what to restore and what to leave drowned. The cores were the answer to that ceiling, the thing the system used to raise the cap itself, and when I fed the first of the 3 to the men forge, I felt the reservoir behind my sternum deepen, the floor of it dropping to make room for restorations I had not been strong enough to attempt an hour before. Suyeon watched my face change as the cap rose and asked what I had just become, and I told her the truth this time, because she had earned it, that I had just stopped being a man who could fix a block and become one who could raise a holding no water could drown. She did not laugh, and she did not look afraid. All she asked was how soon we could put it to use, which was why she was the one person on the spire I trusted at my back. The rising sea made the decision for us before I had finished cataloging what the cache had given me. Water in the hollow was rising while we stood in it, climbing the failing seal from below, at the hand's width a cycle the spire never broke from. And the math of it was the same math that had driven us off the tier above, and would drive us off every layer in turn. Staying on the concourse meant drowning there, a cycle or 2 of holding my restored block against a rising sea that did not care how good my walls were. The only direction that had ever been anything but a trap on this spire was down. That sealed shaft in front of us was the way down, the single descent route off a layer the flood was already taking, and the seal that had held a generation was failing on its own schedule whether I opened it or not. I read the deep rank board on the net before I touched the seal, because a careful man learns what happened to the people who went where he is about to go. The descent rank leaderboard ran deeper than this layer, all the way to the spire's root in theory, and the names on the deep end of it were survivors who had pushed past the layers I knew, down into black water. What the board showed me was something it did not have to say in words. A great many names had descended past the market into the tombs and the levels under them, and a great many of those names had simply stopped posting, their ranks frozen at the depth where the net had last heard from them. The living climbed the board and the dead stayed where they fell on it. Down in the tombs, the board was thick with names that had gone quiet. A quiet I had learned on the top tier to read as the loudest thing the net ever said. I told Suyeon what the board showed, because a partner who follows me into the dark gets to know the odds before she does it, and she heard it the way she heard everything, as data and not as fear. She told me the concourse was already lost to the flood, and that a layer full of the dead who descended was still ground she would rather walk into, beside the one survivor alive who could make the dead things useful. Then she set her restored hand on the failing seal, and asked if we were going to wait for the water to open it or do it ourselves. I had the charge now, the cap raised by the core, the schematic and the blade and the partner, and there was no version of waiting that ended anywhere but drowned. So I put my hand on the old cap beside hers and let the appraisal eye read the last of its history. Then I spent the charge to break what a careful generation had sealed. The seal did not so much open as remember how to, the cap drawing back along seams that had rusted shut decades before the flood, and the transit shaft opened under the concourse for the first time since something had worked very hard to close it. Cold flooded air came up out of it, colder than the water around our knees, carrying the smell of a deeper drowning and the dark of a layer no light had reached in a generation. I stood over the open shaft with Suyeon at my side and the breather hissing in her grip, ready to descend into the tombs the moment the air settled, the deep rank board's frozen names still hanging in the corner of my eye, as a thing to remember and not a thing to obey. My reed worked the throat below us as far as the dark would let it reach, telling me the tunnels widened into drowned transit platforms a level down, that the salvage in them was older and richer than anything the concourse had held, and that the danger sat at a grade my eye had no clean word for. Suyeon asked me what was down there, and I gave her the only honest answer I had, that the board's silent names had all gone quiet at this exact depth, and that whatever took them was still down there waiting on the next descenders foolish enough to come. She tightened her grip on the torch and said she would rather meet it beside the man who restored than alone in the dark. I marked that as one more thing I owed her, and turned my eye back to the shaft to watch the cold air settle. The first thing that came up out of the transit shaft was not air and was not silence. Something climbed the dark of it toward us, slow, wet, wrong, and my appraisal eye opened on it before it cleared the lip and gave me a reading I had no shelf in my head to set it on. It had been a person once, a drowned commuter the transit tombs had taken a generation ago, and the spire had done to it the one thing I had thought only my own hands could do, which was try to restore the dead back toward life. The world had reached into a corpse and rebuilt it. It did the work the way nothing should, a restoration with no understanding behind it. Bone had been set into the wrong joints and flesh closed over the wrong shape, a thing made more than dead and less than alive by a hand that did clumsily and cruelly the exact work I did clean. It hauled itself up over the lip of the shaft, this wrong restored thing that was the inverse of everything I was. A pair of ruined remade eyes turned up out of the dark and fixed on me. The wrong restored thing came over the lip of the shaft with its remade eyes fixed on me, and I did the only thing a man does when a corpse the world has rebuilt decides he looks like the next thing worth taking apart. I read it. My appraisal eye opened a whole sad history of it in the half-second before it lunged, the drowning a generation back, the long settling down through the silt of the transit platform below, and then the blind hand of this broken world reaching down to do clumsily what my own hands did clean. The reading told me the joints had been set wrong on purpose by nothing at all, that the strength of the remade arms was real, but the structure under it was a lie, and it gave me the one gift my eye always gives, the weak point. There was a seam where the rebuilt flesh had closed over the wrong bone and never set. It sat under the left shoulder, a fault line in a body that had been assembled by a thing with no idea what a body was for. I did not fight it the way the deep-ranked names had fought their own ends. Suyan swept the restored torch through the dark behind it so the thing's ruined eyes pulled toward the light, and in the half-beat that bought me I stepped inside its reach and drove the restored salvage blade up under that left shoulder. Straight through the seam this broken world had never closed. The blade went in at a grade above what any tool on this spire had a right to be, because my hands had restored it past its own peak 2 cycles before, and a fault line that had held for decades came apart around it. With its weak point cut open, the wrong restored commuter folded over the edge of the shaft and stopped being anything at all. I crouched and read what was left of it before the water took the rest, and the reading is a thing I carried down with me instead of any pride at having survived the first one. There was a core in it. Not the clean kind I salvaged out of broken machines to raise my own cap, but a corrupted thing. A core grown inside the corpse to power a restoration nothing had any right to attempt. My read named it the engine of the whole wrongness, the part that hauled the drowned upright to walk and grasp at the living, and under that it surfaced one more detail, the one I would spend the next 2 layers failing to stop turning over. The corrupted core was not sitting still in the ruin where I had cut it loose. It was being pulled. A thin constant draw ran through it toward the bottom of the descent, down into the deep dark below. The path water in a hold hole takes when it finds the lowest seam and runs for it. Whatever this broken world was doing to its own dead, it was collecting the results somewhere far below me. We went down. The transit shaft dropped through cold flooded air for longer than the spire had any business holding hollow, and then it opened into the tombs proper. And the tombs were not a market, and were not a loot run, and were not anything the concourse had taught me to expect. They were a drowned transit station the size of the district, platforms stacked 3 deep in black water. The old transit cars still sitting on their dead rails with the doors open the way they had stood open the morning the flood took them. The salvage in them was older and richer than anything above. My eye confirmed that on the first sweep, intact pre-flood machine cores, sealed cabling, and tools that had not corroded in the still cold. Frozen across the platforms were the things people had been carrying when the water came. A satchel still hung on a hook, a child's shoe wedged in a drain grate, a row of fare tokens fused into the lip of a turnstile by long years of cold. None of it touched since the morning of the drowning. A station built to move 10,000 people an hour had become a held breath, and somewhere under that held breath a hand kept reaching into the corpses to make them stand back up. And the dead were everywhere. They were not all standing yet, and most of the tombs drowned were still drowned, settled in the cars and across the platforms where the water had laid them down a generation back. A portion of them had been worked on the same blind way as the one that climbed the shaft, and those ones moved. My read tagged each of them as I picked a path along the highest platform with Suyan at my back, and every tag came back the same: wrong restored, corrupted core, weak point at whatever seam had failed to close. Some had 2 arms set where no arms belonged, and one had been a transit guard once and still wore the rusted shell of a uniform over a body rebuilt into a shape that uniform was never cut for. They turned toward us as we passed, slow and certain, the remade eyes finding the light. And I learned fast that this layer was not a place you cleared. You only crossed it while it noticed you. The crossing taught me the rules of the place, one restored thing at a time. A thing the world had rebuilt did not charge with a living attacker's intent, did not faint, did not fear a blade, a torch, or the count of bodies against it. It came at the warm thing in front of it on a straight line, slow and total, and it kept coming after a wound that would have dropped any living man, because the rot in its chest did not care whether the body it powered still worked. My eye learned to read them at a glance, the ones whose seams had set near enough to make them dangerous against the ones the world had botched so badly they could barely stand. And Suyan learned to trust the read, taking the ones I marked weak and leaving me the ones I marked closed. We moved the platform in that rhythm, my eye sorting the dead into easy and hard, while her restored blade did the easy ones and my own did the rest. And the rhythm held, because we did not stop and we did not let any of them get to our backs. The worst of them were the ones the world had half finished. A thing rebuilt whole was a known quantity, a corrupted core and a working body with a seam to cut, but the platform held bodies the rebuild had reached into and abandoned part way. One torso raised on a single good arm, the other half still settled in the silt. A head that turned to track our torch on a neck nothing had ever closed. Things caught between drowned and risen that should not have moved at all, and moved anyway. My eye read those as the same wrong restoration run partway installed, and the reading taught me what an engineer's log would later put into words. that the hand doing this work had no understanding behind it, only the blind reflex to make the dead stand again, whether or not standing was a thing the body could still do. I checked the net once we were down, because a careful man learns what the dark already knows before he asks it himself. The descent rank board ran deeper here than it had above, and the deep end of it was a graveyard of frozen names, survivors who had pushed past the concourse down through the tombs and the levels under them, then stopped posting at the exact depth my boots now stood on. A death counter ticked beside it while I read, a number the system kept of everyone the spire had taken since the wake, and the count moved faster at this depth than it had on any layer above. Beside the board, the survivor chat scrolled thin and ugly. Descenders warning descenders off this place. A handful of names trading the one piece of advice the deep layers ever agreed on. Never let the walking ones surround you, and never, under any circumstance, follow them when they walk away from you instead of toward you. I filed that last one because it would matter sooner than I wanted. Suyeon read the platform the way she read rubble, fast and total, and she was the one who said out loud the thing my read had been circling since we climbed down. She said the moving dead were all walking the same way when they were not walking at us, and I watched the next pack she pointed at and found she was right. A wrong restored cluster that had lost interest in our light turned as a body and shuffled off toward the far end of the lowest platform. They made for a service stair that dropped further down, and they went the way the corrupted core in the first one had been pulled. Down, always down, toward whatever sat at the bottom collecting them. The corpses were being called home. Something under the spire was reeling its harvest in one drowned commuter at a time, and the wrongness in every core I had read since climbing down pointed at the same buried place. I crouched at the head of the highest platform with the cold air sitting on the black water below, and put the whole picture together for the first time. Quiet, in the one place I trusted to hold a thought, the inside of my own head. The world auto-restored its dead and did it wrong, and the wrongness it grew was a corrupted core, and the corrupted cores were being drawn down toward the spire's root. My Menforge did clean what this broken world did cruel. The exact same act. Restoration, run by a hand that understood what it was rebuilding. Whatever lived at the bottom of this spire was a thing that did the opposite of understanding, and it had been at work on a whole drowned world for a generation, hauling the results down toward itself one core at a time. I did not have a name for it yet. What I had instead was a direction. The corpses were walking toward it. The board's frozen survivors had walked toward it, and the only way off this spire ran the same road they all took. Down. Toward a dark where something had been quietly unmaking the drowned since before any of us woke. I stood, and I told Suyeon we were going where the drowned were going, because the only safe place on a spire that fed everything downward was in front of the thing doing the feeding, not behind it. Then I read the service stair the dead had taken, and we went down after them. The service stair led us out onto a flooded interchange 2 levels under the station, and that was where I heard a living voice for the first time since the concourse, somebody cursing in a language I did not know from inside a collapsed shaft half drowned in black water, and my appraisal eye found her before my torch did. She was wedged into a flooded maintenance shaft with a dead dive rig strapped to her back, the air in the rig long since spent, and the only reason she was still breathing was a pocket of trapped air, the size of a coffin that the rising water was eating one finger with at a time. The reading gave me her whole bad afternoon in a glance. A dive that had gone too deep, a rig that had failed at the worst depth a rig can fail, and a shaft that had folded shut behind her and left her to drown slow, with a clear view of the way out she could not reach. I could have left her. A pragmatic man does the math on a stranger fast, and the math on Lena Crow that first minute was that pulling her out cost me charge and bought me a mouth I would have to feed. The thing that changed the math was the rig, which my eye read as the best piece of salvage I had seen since the brass cache, a pre-flood breather built for depths the tombs would have laughed at, ruined now but ruined in ways I could undo. A man who can restore a thing past its peak does not leave the best breather on the spire to rot in a flooded shaft, because the diver inside it is inconvenient. So I told Suyeon to brace the shaft mouth, and I put my hand through the cold water onto the dead rig, and I read it down to its last failed seal. Before I spent the charge, the restore took the breather back up past everything it had been. Its cracked tank knit whole, the spent scrubber came back rated for air it had never been built to clean, and the regulator that had killed her came back a full grade above the one the pre-flood divers had trusted their lives to. I felt the cap drop in my chest as the charge went out of me. The cost of a restore that size, and then the rig at her back hissed full and started feeding her clean air through a mask that fit a face it had not been cut for. She breathed. The first thing she did with that lungful of restored air was grin at me through the water. In a flooded shaft, she had been dying in a minute before. That grin told me everything I needed to know about Lena Crow, before she had said one word I could understand. We pulled her out, and she came up coughing and laughing at once, a wiry foreign girl with the diver's scarred hands and a grin that did not seem to understand the situation it was in. The grin went onto the rig at her back, then onto me, then back onto the rig, working out by feel that the thing strapped to her had come back better than the day it was built. Once she had enough English back to ask anything she wanted to know, what I had done to it, and I told her the truth in the short version, that I had restored it, that restoring was the only talent I had, and the only one the spire would let me keep. There was no junkman laughter in her, none of the concourse sneer, A scarred hand went flat on the restored tank, felt the grate of it, and she said that a man who could do that to a ruined rig was a man she would scout flooded shafts for until one of them finally killed her, which on the net's deep board was a sentence with a short expected length. I marked her as the third person on this spire worth keeping at my back, and put her in front, where a diver belongs. She earned the spot inside the hour. Lena went into water I could not follow her into and came back with a map of the interchange in her head. Every flooded passage, every drowned car, every drop that went deeper, and she found the thing in the wreckage that turned the next layer from survival into something else. She surfaced in the middle of a collapsed transit junction, shook the water off, and told me there was a dead machine down there too big to be salvaged and too intact to leave, half buried under a fallen rail gantry where the flood had pinned it the day it died. I went down to read it myself, because some things you do not take on a scout's word, and what my eye opened on the bottom of that junction changed the shape of the descent for me. It was a transit war drone. The old city had built them to hold the transit lines in the last bad years before the flood. A squat armored thing on a ring of treads, with a cutting arm and a hardened core. It had been dead for a generation under the water that killed it, but dead in the specific manner machines die, which is to say nothing close to how a person dies. A machine that has stopped is just a machine waiting for someone to understand it. My appraisal eye read the war drone down to the last seized bearing and corroded line, and it told me 3 things. The drone was repairable, and a restorer would bring it back a grade above the day the city fielded it. And my Menforge held one more function I had carried since the wake without ever finding a worthy thing to spend it on. There was a bind in the Menforge that let me claim what I restored, bring a stalled machine back better than new and make it mine. I spent 2 cycles of charge on that drone and counted it the best trade I had made since the spire woke. The restore knit the seized treads loose and brought the cutting arm back to an edge, no pre-flood blade it held, and the hardened core came up rated for a load the city's engineers would have called impossible. When the work was done, I laid the bind into it as the Menforge had shown me, a thread run from my own reservoir into the drone's restored core, and it came online under my hand. The thing the flood had killed a generation back rose up out of the silt of the junction on restored treads, turned its cutting arm toward me, and waited for an order, because it was mine now, the first restored unit I had ever fielded, and a grade above anything else walking this layer. Suyan watched the drone stand and said the quiet thing I had been thinking, that everyone else on this spire fought the wrong restored dead with their hands and their salvaged blades, and lost a little of themselves every time, while I had just turned the layer's own dead machines into a thing that fought for me. That was the shape of it exactly. The tombs were full of dead, the dead included dead machines, and where every other descender saw the war drones as one more hazard in the dark, I saw a standing army the flood had pre-killed and left for the one man on the spire who could bring it back. Lena put her grin on the drone and asked how many more of these were down here, and my eye had already counted. There were a great many. We met the survivor group at the edge of the next platform, 4 descenders who had come down off the concourse a cycle ahead of us and gotten this far on grit and salvaged blades. They looked at me the way the concourse always had, at the wiry repair tech with no obvious strength and a scrap drone clanking at his heel. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a salvaged spear and a concourse rank below mine he had not bothered to check, told me to keep my junk away from his people and asked what a man with a broken toaster on treads thought he was going to do when the dead came up the platform. I did not answer him. The tombs answered him for me because the dead came up the platform while he was still talking. A wrong restored pack came over the lip of the lower platform, 6 of them, the worst kind. The ones that had stopped walking toward the bottom and turned back toward the warm living things on the upper deck. The survivor group set their salvaged spears and braced to lose someone, the bracing of 4 people who know that 6 things which do not feel pain are coming at them. I gave the drone one order. It went off the platform edge into the pack on its restored treads with the cutting arm leading. What a pre-flood war drone restored a grade past its peak does to 6 wrong restored corpses is not a fight so much as a sorting. The cutting arm finding the unset seam in each of them as my eye had taught it. 6 weak points opened in the time it took the heavy-set man to lower his useless spear. The pack went down. My drone rolled back to my heel with silt on its arm and waited for the next order that did not come, because there was no next thing to cut. One of his 4 had been on the net the whole approach, betting in the survivor chat on how fast the wrong restored pack would gut the junk man's scrap drone, and I caught the bet scroll past while my drone was still cleaning silt off its arm. The chat had given the toaster on treads about a 6 count before the pack tore it apart. It had taken the drone less than that to put the whole pack down. The better went quiet on the net the way men go quiet when the scrap they wagered against turns out to be the very thing that just saved their life. And the chat that had been laughing at the scrap drone started very carefully asking who the restorer was and whether he was taking on hands. After that, the heavy-set man did not call it a broken toaster again. He looked at the 6 wrong restored corpses his 4 spears had been ready to die against. All of them down and none of his people touched. Then he looked at the scrap drone at the junk man's heel, and he did the math the concourse had taught everyone too late, which is that you measure a restorer not by what he carries, but by what he can make of what is already dead. He asked, with a great deal less spear in his voice, whether we were heading down, and whether his 4 might walk where my drone walked. I told him the price of walking with me, because I always tell the price, and he paid it without arguing, which is the only kind of follower worth having on a spire that drowns the slow. We pushed on into a dead maintenance bay below the platform, the deepest dry room the interchange still had, and that was where Lena's scout light caught what turned the descent from a survival run into a question. A pre-flood terminal sat against the far wall, a maintenance station the transit authority had used to run this whole layer, dark for a generation, its screen a dead gray pane fogged with the cold. It should have been one more dead thing in a layer full of them, but when Lena's light crossed it the screen flickered, once, a dying twitch of charge in a machine that had been holding a single failing breath of power for longer than any of us had been alive, and a line of pre-flood text ghosted across the dead pane for half a second before the cold swallowed it again. My eye read the terminal before I touched it, and it was repairable. Whatever it had been built to record, it was still holding, down at the bottom of a dead battery, waiting for a hand that could bring it back. I put my palm flat on the cold pane and read it down to the last failed cell, and then I spent the charge to wake a machine that had something to say. The terminal woke under my hand a full grade above the day the authority had installed it, the dead gray pane coming up clear and bright in a maintenance bay that had not held a working light in a generation. It had been holding its last record the whole time, a drowned thing clutching its final breath, and when I gave it power again, it spent that record on the four of us in the cold. A maintenance log played across the restored pane, dated to the final days before the flood, an engineer recording the state of the layer for a city that would be underwater before anyone read it, and I had expected a fault report. What the dead engineer left behind was the first true thing I had heard about how this world ended. The log spoke of the unmakers. In a voice flattened by the exhaustion of recording a thing nobody would believe, the engineer set down that the sinking of Drownspire had not been a disaster, but a decision. Something the pre-flood city had called by that name had reached the spire and begun the deliberate work of taking it apart. Seals failed that no fault could explain, machines came undone in ways nowhere could account for, and the city's own dead refused to stay dead and rose wrong. A single word ran through every entry for what those things did, and the word was unmaking, the running of restoration in reverse, and he said it had a direction. Everything the unmakers touched went down, drawn toward the spire's root, toward a place under the city he did not have a name for. Then the log ended where the engineer ran out of either power or time, and the restored pane went quiet, and the bay held nothing but the four of us, the cold and a word none of us had wanted. Old Marin had followed us down, and I had known she was behind us since the service stair, the half-blind veteran salvager who had told me on the concourse that the spire remembers what it was, keeping a careful distance through the tombs, without once offering to walk in the light. She came into the bay while the log was still playing, and I watched her face for the whole of it, because you learn more from who flinches than from what plays. The corpses drew no flinch from her, for she had seen worse than corpses. What aged her gray on the spot was the single word, the unmaking, and her good eye fixed on the restored pane with the dread of someone who has spent a whole life hoping that word was only a story. When I asked her what she knew, she told me nothing, which from old Marin was the loudest answer she could have given. She turned her face away from the terminal and would not look at it again, and I filed her silence next to the engineer's word as two halves of a truth somebody had worked very hard to drown. There was a thing she did before she turned away that I kept. Her good eye went from the restored pane to my hands, the hands that had just woken a dead machine and pulled its last truth out of the cold. And the dread that had aged her gray was not all for the word on the screen. Some of it was for me. I had long since learned to read the moment someone stops seeing me as a useful stranger and starts seeing me as a thing that matters in a story they already know, and I read that moment cross old Marin's face plain as a posted rank. She had heard the unmaking named, and she had looked at the one survivor on the spire whose whole talent was the reverse of it, and she had put the two together watches before I would let myself finish the same thought out loud. Whatever she knew where I fit in it. She just was not ready to be the one who told me, and I was not foolish enough to push a half-blind veteran who had survived this long on the strength of the things she chose not to say. I put the rest together myself, quiet, in the bay's cold, while Lena watched the dark and Suion watched Marin. The world auto-restored its dead and did it wrong, growing corrupted cores that were drawn downward toward the spire's root. A pre-flood engineer had given the thing doing it the name Unmakers, and called their act the reverse of restoration. And my Menforge did clean with understanding. The precise act those things did cruel and blind. Restoration, which meant the talent the system had handed me, was the exact opposite of whatever had sunk this world. That was not a comfort. Nobody survives a flood by being its opposite. You survive by being useful to the people around you and dangerous to the people against you. And so I closed the thought, filed the word, and said nothing to anyone but Suion, because a truth that big is a thing you carry quiet until you know what it costs to set down. Then I went back to being useful, because dread is a luxury and a holding is not. This bay was the deepest dry room the transit layer had, a defensible box with one wide approach and a ceiling that had held a generation of water above it without failing. And someone who has just learned the world is being deliberately unmade does not stand in the dark and brood about it. He builds walls. I spent the charge I had banked and ran a second stronghold restore in that bay, as I had raised the first on the concourse. The failed bulkhead doors came back a grade past their rated load, the cracked ceiling braces knit whole, and the bay's old power line and trap conduits woke under my hand. A dead maintenance station became a holding the rising water would have to work to take. The drone I set at the approach, and Lena I set in the water, scouting the ways down. And Suyeon ran the salvage line that fed the whole thing, the way she had run it above. I armed them out of the layer zone dead. The tombs were thick with salvage, richer than anything the concourse had held. Pre-flood gear the descenders above me had not had the talent to bring back, and I went through it with the cold focus of someone sorting a fortune left to no one. For Suyeon, I restored a transit guard's hardened vest back into something no flooding blade would open. Lena got a pre-flood cutting tool that took an edge her dive knife had never dreamed of. I salvaged cores out of 3 more dead machines to raise my cap another step, so the restores came faster and cost me less of myself each time. The refugees the heavyset man had brought got restored salvage too, because a holding is only as strong as the weakest hand in it, and whoever arms his people from the dead around them never runs short of arms. By the end of the watch, the bay was a transit stronghold, the second I had raised on the descent, and the people in it were carrying gear a grade above anything the layer above had ever fielded. I checked the net before I let myself rest, the way I always do, and the net was where the next thing found me. The descent rank board had moved me, because my clean restores in the tombs had registered on the system the way kills registered for everyone else, and the board now ranked me well inside the top 30 of the entire descent, a junkman sitting above swordsmen and brawlers who had killed their way down. That should have been a quiet victory. It was not, because the survivor chat scrolling beside the board had started saying my holding's name, and the name was being said by the wrong people. I went through the chat the way I work everything, fast and total, sorting the begging from the hunting. Most of it was the usual tombs traffic, descenders trading the depth of the water and the count of the dead, a handful begging directions to a holding they could shelter in before the flood took the next platform. Under that ran a thinner thread, careful and patient, 3 or 4 accounts that asked nothing about shelter and everything about location, the grade of my walls, the count of my drones, the exact thing a buyer asks before a raid and never before a rescue. The death counter ticked the entire time, the system's running tally of everyone the spire had swallowed since the wake, and at this depth the number climbed steady enough that a careful man learned to treat it as the clock it was. I had perhaps a watch before the patient accounts stopped asking and started arriving. The only way that watch ever paid was building, so I built. By then the chat had found out what I was doing, because word of a restorer who raised strongholds out of dead salvage and fielded restored war drones had climbed back up the net to the layers above, and not everyone who read it was a descender looking for a wall to shelter behind. The intact gear trade on the upper layers ran on scarcity, on the simple pre-flood fact that working equipment could not be made anymore, and so could only be hoarded, and a man who could turn any dead thing into gear better than intact was not a curiosity to the people who held that monopoly. He was a threat to the price of everything they owned. I read the names in the chat that were asking, very politely, exactly where in the transit layer the restorer had built his holding, and I traced who those names answered to, and the answer was the one city-state on the spire with the most to lose from someone like me. Breinhold was coming. The net told me before any scout could, the descent rank board lighting up with a cluster of names moving down through the layers in formation, a sponsored force descending fast and direct toward the transit tombs, toward the exact coordinates the polite names in the chat had been fishing for. Breinhold held the largest cache of intact pre-flood gear on the spire, and built its whole power on the scarcity of it, and a restore economy that made their hoard worthless was a thing they would spend lives to strangle in the layer where it was born. They were not coming to descend. Their object was to seize the workshop, to take the man who threatened their monopoly before the monopoly stopped being worth holding, and the board's frozen name graveyard down in the deep was full of proof that nobody on this spire descended in tight formation toward a fixed point unless they meant to take it. I read the descending cluster down to the count and the kit, and then I stood up in my restored holding with that deep dread filed away, and a closer fight walking down the layers toward me. When Suyeon asked what the board was showing, I told her plain, that a Breinhold force was descending on us to take the holding and the restorer in it before the restore economy grew teeth, that they were moving in formation and would reach the transit bay within the watch. She did not ask whether we ran. Her questions were how many they were sending, and how soon I could put the dead around us to work, the only ones that mattered. My bay had one wide approach, and I had a layer full of dead machines and a talent that turned other men's trash into a grade of war they had not learned to fear yet. The Breinhold force came up the wide approach in good order, 24 of them in matched gear, the kind of column a city sends when it expects the fight to be over before the enemy understands when it's started. They carried intact pre-flood weapons, the hoarded kind Breinhold built its whole power on, and they moved with the easy confidence of people who had never once met a wall they could not buy their way through. I watched them come from the restored bulkhead with Suyeon beside me, and I did not reach for a weapon, because the worst thing a man in my position can do is fight a war column the way it wants to be fought. Winning fights is not the talent I was handed. Reading them is, and then I let what I have built win them for me. My appraisal eye opened on the column the moment it cleared the approach, and it gave me every raider in it down to the seam. The lead breacher's intact shield had a hairline stress fault along its lower edge the Breinhold smiths had never found. On the left, a marksman favored a bad knee that would fold the instant he had to move off his mark. 3 of the matched suits had been patched at the joint with salvage that did not match the rating of the plate, a weak point the wearers did not know they carried, and the captain at the back ran the whole column off a confidence that would crack the moment the easy fight stopped being easy. Being stronger than any of them was never the point. Knowing where each one broke was, and my eye had handed me 24 answers before the first of them set foot on my trap grid. Then the trap grid took the front rank, because I had restored the bay's old conduit floor a grade past what the transit authority ever ran through it. That lead breacher with the faulted shield stepped onto a plate I had woken back to life, and the restored conduit dumped a pre-flood charge through his intact gear. That intact gear had never been rated to shrug off, and he went down at the threshold without my people lifting a hand. The whole formation checked. That half-second of hesitation, the first crack in a confidence built on never being surprised, was the whole opening I needed, and I gave the order I had been holding. Soha took them from there. And that was the watch I learned what I had sheltering in my own holding. She had ridden down with the refugees, an ex-soldier who had lost her whole squad on an upper layer and gone quiet about it, and I had marked her as one more mouth until the attackers hit my approach, and something in her woke up. Without being asked, she put herself at the head of my restored drones and my armed refugees. Read the broken column in a glance, the way only someone who had held a line before could, and started giving orders that turned a holding full of frightened salvagers into a fighting line. I had built the walls. Soha made them fight. She set the war drone where the raiders would have to funnel, put the refugees with their restored gear behind the second bulkhead where their weak hands were covered, and held the whole shape of it in her head, while the Brinehold captain was still trying to understand why his easy raid had stopped moving. The column broke against a wall it had no shape for. Soha sent the bound war drone into the funnel, and the cutting arm found the salvage patch joints my eye had flagged. 3 matched suits opened at the exact seam their wearers had trusted, and the marksman with the bad knee folded the moment Soha forced him off his mark. Refugees the concourse had written off held the second bulkhead with restored gear a grade above anything Brinehold carried, and every place the raiders pushed, they found a wall that pushed back harder than walls have any right to. Their captain spent his confidence in the manner of a hold hull losing its air, fast and all at once, and within the watch the matched column sent to take my workshop was a knot of broken raiders trying to get back up the approach they had walked down so easily. Baek Naeun kept us whole through the worst of it. She was a medic and a chem salvager, another of the refugees I had armed without knowing what I had, and when the first of my people went down under an intact Brinehold blade, she was already there with a kit of restored medicine that worked a full grade above anything the pre-flood pharmacies had bottled. I had restored a case of drowned medical salvage 2 watches before without thinking past the value of it, and Naeun turned that case into the reason the line did not bleed out. She moved through the holding under the fighting, pulled the wounded behind the bulkhead, and put them back together with restored compounds that closed wounds the raiders had opened to kill. By the end, she had not lost one of mine, and a holding that loses no one is a holding that wins twice, because every hand she saved was a hand still holding a wall. I learned both of them in that one watch, which is the only way you ever truly learn anyone, by what they do when the wall is being tested. Soa had spent the time since the wake making herself small, a woman who had watched her squad die on an upper layer and decided the safest thing left was to be no one worth following. The raid burned that off her in a few breaths. She read my restored funnel and my bound drone and my frightened refugees, and she made them into a defense that held, and when it was over she did not ask for thanks or a share, only for whatever gear I could spare so she would be ready the next time a wall of mine was tested. Naeun was the opposite kind of quiet, a chem salvager who had kept her head down because a medic who looks useful gets hoarded by every faction on the spire. She showed me her real worth by spending it, working under the fighting where the credit went to the people holding the line, and asking afterward only whether I would keep restoring the salvage that let her keep my people breathing. I told both of them the same thing I'd tell anyone who proves out, that they had a place at my back for as long as they wanted it, and I meant it. A man who builds his strength out of dead salvage learns fast that living people who prove themselves are the one thing he cannot restore, and the one thing worth more than any core. Then came the part the concourse would never have believed. The part I had been building toward since I first walked the tombs. As the column broke, I had my people strip the downed raiders, and what we stripped off them was the same intact Brinehold gear they had carried in to kill us with. Hoarded equipment a whole city-state had built its power on, and I restored it where it lay. The intact shields and matched suits and pre-flood blades that Brinehold treated as the height of what a survivor could own came back under my hand a full grade above what they had been, and I put them into the hands of the exact refugees Brinehold's raiders had stepped over as worthless an hour before. My people armed themselves from the bodies of the men who had marched in to take their walls, and every weapon got better in the taking. The net caught it before I had finished the work, and survivor chat that had spent the watch betting on how fast Brinehold would crush the Junkman's scrap holding went quiet, then ugly, then turned, in the manner the net always turns once the thing everyone was sure of stops being true. Descenders who had laughed at a restorer holding a bay against the city's column were now asking, very fast, whether the holding was taking shelter cases, whether the man who outgeared Breinhold from Breinhold's own trash had room for a few more hands. The descent rank board moved me again while I read, the clean defense registering on the system as hard as a kill did for everyone else. And a junkman the upper layers had written off 2 watches before sat ranked above the very city-state that had sent 24 matched fighters to erase him. I let the chat say it for me, because a man who brags loses the next trade, and the net was bragging loud enough for both of us. One raider lived to see it, the captain pinned under his own broken column, with his confidence gone and his appraisal grade reading charm still working. He used it on my holding while my refugee stripped his men, and I watched his face do the math the concourse had done too late. The charm told him what his eyes would not. Every wall around him stood restored past intact, and that drone which broke his column was a dead machine made better than the day it was built. And the gear now arming the refugees he had dismissed was his own city's horde turned a full grade above the day it left the Breinhold vault. He had brought intact gear to take a workshop, and the workshop had outgeared his whole city from the trash his own men were standing on. I read the moment it landed on him, the understanding that Breinhold's monopoly had already lost, that scarcity meant nothing against a man who made anything dead into something better, and that he had spent a matched column to teach the one man on the spire he should have left alone exactly how cheaply his city's power could be beaten. The raiders broke and ran, the ones who could still run, dragging their captain back up the approach with the city's gear no longer on their backs. Sioha let them go, because a captain who chases a broken enemy into a flooded lair she does not own is a captain who loses people she just saved, and she had not lost a single one. The holding stood, my walls had held, my drone had cut, my refugees were armed a grade above the city that came to crush them, and I had a defense captain and a medic I had not known I owned a watch before. By every count that mattered, I had won, cleanly and completely, and that was the exact thing that made me uneasy. It had been too easy. I stood in my held bay with the broken column running and the spoils piling up, and the longer I looked at the fight the less it sat right, so I went back over it the only way I trust, with my appraisal eye. The whole engagement read out again under it, the kit they had carried, the order they had come in, the way they had spent themselves, and the reading came back with the wrong shape. A city that hoarded intact gear to crush a threat sends its best to make sure the threat dies. This column had marched in good order, and matched kit, but my eye read no apex fighters in it, no city killers. Nothing Breinhold could not stand to lose. They had pushed hard enough to look real and folded fast enough to cost the city almost nothing, and a force that fights to resemble a raid without ever trying to win. One is not a raid at all. It is a distraction. Somewhere, while I spent a watch winning a fight Breinhold had been willing to lose, the thing the fight was meant to hide had been getting its real work done. The net told me what the Feint had bought before any scout could reach me. Its death counter, the system's running tally of everyone the spire had swallowed, spiked while I stood in my held bay reading the broken column. And it did not spike the way it spiked when one descender met one bad end. It jumped the way it jumps when a layer drowns all at once, the count climbing in a hard run that meant a drowning was taking people somewhere by the dozen, and the survivor chat went from mocking Breinhold to a single rising panic about the transit seals. Somebody had opened them. While I won a fight a city was willing to lose, somebody had walked behind it and opened the flood seals on the whole layer. They had done it, the flood-worshipping cult the deep board whispered about, the descenders who did not fight the drowning but served it. And they had used the Breinhold raid for cover, a fire set to pull every eye one way while the real theft went the other. My appraisal eye read the bay's seals the instant the counter jumped, and the reading turned my held holding into a trap with the lid coming down. The descent shaft behind my stronghold, the one route down off the transit layer, had been sealed shut from beyond while I was busy at the front, and the layer's flood seals had been cracked wide in the same watch, the water already climbing the lower platforms. That cult had not come to fight me at all. Their purpose was to drown me in the holding I had built, with the only way down welded shut behind the walls I was so proud of. I read the whole shape of it in the time it took the counter to climb another notch. The raid had been a feint to draw my force and my attention to the wide front approach, and while Sioha broke the column at the gate, the saltbound had slipped to the back and done their real work, sealing my descent route and opening the layer to the flood. Within the watch, the whole of the tombs would be underwater. Every dry room I had restored, every wall I had raised, every trap I had woken would be drowned the same as the concourse before it, and the people I had armed would drown with them unless I found another way down faster than rising water found us. There was one. My eye had marked it watches before and filed it as a problem for later, and later had just arrived. I read their hand in it without ever seeing a cultist, because that kind of work signs itself. The saltbound did not loot, hold walls, or trade on the net. They sealed routes and opened seals, and every place they touched went the direction the corrupted cores went, down toward the deep, toward whatever sat at the spire's root collecting the drowned. Standing in my doomed holding with the counter climbing, I understood for the first time that the cult, the wrong restored dead, and the pull I had felt in that first corrupted core were all the same hand working the same way, hurrying the world's unmaking along. The flood was not a disaster the saltbound endured. It was a thing they served. The engineer's word fit those flood servants as cleanly as it fit the dead. I filed that next to the rest and spent no more of the watch on it, because a man learns the nature of his enemy on his own time and survives a flood on the floods. the sealed biovault shaft. Lena had scouted it on her first sweep of the layer, a second descent route on the opposite side of the flooding platforms, sealed by a pre-flood lock she could not breach, and I had not yet bothered to read. It went down past the tombs toward the next layer, and it was the only door left that the Saltbound had not welded shut behind us, because they had not known I would reach for a second route, or they had not had the hands to seal them both. The water decided it for me, the same as it had decided every move I had made since I woke. Staying meant drowning in a holding with one sealed door. This shaft was the other door, and the flood was already counting down the watches I had to reach it. I gave the orders the way I give them, fast and total, with no time spent on the part of me that did not want to abandon a holding I had bled to build. Seoha got the column moving. My people and the refugees and the gear we could carry formed up behind the restored war drone and driving for the far platforms before the water reached the second bulkhead. Nayoon took the wounded and the weak hands into the center of the move where the strong gear covered them. Lena went ahead into the climbing water to hold the route to the vault open, scouting a path through flooding platforms that were filling faster than I had watches to cross them. And Suyeon ran beside me with the salvage that mattered, the cores and the charge I would need at the bottom, since reaching the next door with nothing left to open it only changes where a man drowns. We did not walk to the vault. Walking was for people the water had not already caught, so we drove. I had restored the transit cars on the dead rails 2 watches before, without a clear use for them, the old drowned cars that had sat with their doors open ever since the morning of the drowning. Now I spent the last of my banked charge bringing the nearest line of them up past their peak. Motors that had not turned in a generation waking under my hand on rails I restored a span at a time ahead of us. My people loaded onto restored transit cars while the sea climbed the platform behind them, and the line pulled out of my drowning stronghold on its own restored power, driving along the dead rails toward the far side of the tombs, with the rising water at the back wheels. The holding I had built went under in our wake. I did not look back at it, because a holding is a thing you build again, and a watch spent mourning one is a watch the rising tide takes you in. That drive was the worst stretch of the whole descent, and not because of the rising water. The wrong restored dead were in the flood with us. Opening the seals had done more than drown the layer. It had loosed a tide that lifted every drowned thing clear of the platforms and carried it on the current, and a layer full of corpses the world had been raising for a generation came loose all at once. They washed against the moving cars, surfaced in the headlight wash on the rails ahead, reached up out of the climbing dark with remade hands that found the warm light of us and held on. Seoha worked the war drone and a line of restored gear off the rear car, cutting loose the ones that caught the train, while Lena ran ahead through the current clearing the rails of the bodies it had piled across them. My eye sorted the dead in the headlights faster than I had ever sorted anything, marking the closed ones to drive through, and the open ones to cut. The train ran the gauntlet on that read alone, a span of rail at a time, the water and the dead both rising while we drove between them toward the one door left. Through all of it, the net was a wall of panic, and I worked it the way I work everything, taking only what told me where the water was not yet. Its death counter ran hard the entire run. Descenders all across the transit tombs meeting the sea I was outrunning. Names dropping from the board at a rate the deep end had not seen since the wake. Survivor chat had stopped mocking anyone, and it begged for routes, for high ground, for any door the cult had missed. 1,000 survivors I would never meet, learned in the same watch the lesson the cult existed to teach. That the water always wins a layer in the end, and the only argument left is how fast you go down to the next one. I closed the chat. My route was set, my people were on restored rails, and the only number that mattered now was the gap between my front wheels and the door at the end of the line. We reached the biovault shaft with the rising water a platform back and closing. The restored cars carried us across the last of the tombs to a sealed bulkhead in the far wall. A heavy pre-flood vault door set into the rock, where the descent dropped toward the next layer, and Lena was already there, treading water marking the lock for me. My people came off the cars onto the last dry ledge the layer had left. The war drone, the wounded, and the armed refugees packed onto a shrinking shelf of stone, while the sea climbed the wheels of the line at our backs. Soha set the defense at our backs out of habit, though the only thing bearing down on us was water. The net's death counter was a blur by then, the system unable to keep a clean tally of a layer drowning all at once. The number climbing in a hard unbroken run that a careful man reads as the whole transit tombs going under in real time. Names I had passed on the platforms a watch before vanished from the descent board in clusters. The survivor chat had gone past panic into the flat quiet of people who have stopped expecting a door, and I read that quiet and I closed it, because there was one door left and I was standing at it. There was nothing to do but open it and go down, and opening doors was the one thing on this whole drowning spire I had never once failed to do. I put my hand on the biovault lock and let my appraisal eye read it, as I had read every seal, machine, and corpse since the wake, expecting the same flood of history, danger, and weak point my eye had handed me 1,000 times. It gave me nothing. The reading opened on the pre-flood lock and came back blank. Not the simple empty of a thing with no history, but the deliberate blank of a wall built to stop a reading. A dark put there on purpose, where my eye had never once met a dark before. I read it again, harder, and the appraisal eye that had opened the history of every dead thing on the descent returned the first true nothing it had ever given me. A lock it could not see into. A door it could not tell me how to open. Water reached the last dry ledge and began to climb my people's boots. The sea sat seconds from the shelf, the holding behind us gone, the layer above sealed, and for the first time since the world broke, I stood in front of a door my talent could not read, with the flood coming up to take us and no answer behind my eye at all. The blank stayed blank no matter how hard I pushed at it, and the water was at my people's boots, so I stopped doing the one thing I had done at every door since the wake, and did the opposite. My appraisal eye could not read this lock because the seal was built before the world broke, and the system that fed my eye had no entry for it. A pre-flood mechanism the Menforge simply did not catalog. And what the system cannot name is what the system cannot show me. I had been trying to read a door I was never meant to read. So I quit reading it and put my hand flat against the stalled mechanism instead, reached past the blank into the only thing about that lock my talent had ever truly understood, which was that it sat broken, and I let the restore find the break as it found every break, by touch and not by sight. The Menforge did not need a thing's history to know it was dead. That was the whole shape of what the system had handed me, an engine that worked on the fact of a break, and not on the story of it. And the mechanism was as broken as anything I had ever touched. A seized pre-flood throw that had not turned since the morning of the drowning. I poured charge into it blind, restoring a thing I could not see the inside of, trusting the engine to find the dead bearings and corroded throws my reading refused to show me. The lock came back under my hand a grade above the day the dead city had set it. Every seized part loosening at once, the heavy throws driving home and then driving open on restored power. That blank swung wide. I had opened a door I could not read. Now the biovault stood open in front of us with the sea at our backs, and I put my people through it as you put cargo through a closing hatch, fast and in the right order. Lena went first into the dark to hold the far side. Sioha drove the war drone through to anchor the landing. Naeun took the wounded down on the heels of the drone where the strong gear covered them. Suyan stayed at my shoulder with the cores and the charge, and the armed refugees poured down past us into the vault, while the water climbed the last of the dry ledge behind us. When the last hand was through, I put a final pour of charge into the restored lock, and threw it shut from the inside, the heavy throws driving home a grade harder than they had opened, and the sea that had chased us across a drowning layer hit the far side of that door and stopped. The tombs drowned behind a wall I had restored. We were below it now, sealed in the dark, dry for the first time in a watch, and alive. I let myself study the room before I let myself rest, because a dry room you have not read is a trap you have not sprung yet. This place was nothing the concourse or the tombs had been. The concourse had been a drowned market to loot, and the tombs had been a graveyard that walked. But this was a pre-flood laboratory, a sealed deep vault the dead city had built to hold things it did not want loose, and it had ridden out the drowning closed. My appraisal eye opened on it and got readings again, history and danger flowing back the way they always had now that I was past the one blank door. What they told me was that everything down here had been engineered, that nothing had drowned by accident, and that every system in the place had been built to keep something in rather than to keep the water out. Dead containment ran the length of the vault, in long ranks, sealed grids and stilled fields and holding cells, the size of transit cars, all of them powered down a generation ago, and silent ever since. My reading found the bones of it as we moved through, the lab zone machinery, the cold lines that had once held charge, the grids that had once held fields, every one of them dead in the specific engineered manner the door had been dead. Broken on purpose, or broken by time yet always broken clean. There was no rot of the kind the tombs had carried. No drowned dead rising wrong, because nothing down here had ever been left open to the water long enough to drown. The biovault had sealed itself the morning the world broke, and held its breath ever since, and we had just become the first warm thing to walk it in a generation. Even here the drowned spire net found me, and what it showed me was the thing I had been half waiting for since the lock came back blank. I opened the chat out of habit, to size up the layer as I size up every layer, and the net had nothing to give me. The descent rank board, which had tracked my position down every layer since the comm course, showed my marker frozen at the lip of the biovault shaft and going no further, because the system's public map ended at that sealed door and reached no further down. For the first time since the spire woke, I had walked off the edge of the map everyone else could see. No descender in the chat could mark my position, and no scout could fish my coordinates out of the board. The net that had carried every threat to me before it arrived could not see one span past the door I had restored shut, which meant for the length of this layer I was running blind. And so was everyone who might come for me. I weighed that as I weigh everything, for what it cost and what it bought. Blind meant the brine hold could not track me and the saltbound could not seal a route they could not find, and that was worth a great deal to a man two factions wanted dead. It also meant nobody up the spire would know if this layer ate me. No chat would carry word of the junk man drowning in a sealed lab, and a man who vanishes off the board vanishes whether he died or only went where the board could not follow. I filed both halves and kept moving, because the only thing to do with a layer no one can see you on is to read it faster than it reads you, and my appraisal eye had already started to show me the shape of what the builders had raised this vault to hold. Old Marin caught up to me at the head of the move, half blind and slower than the rest, and I watched this drowned lab do something to the old salvager's face that no layer above had managed. Marin knew this place. Not the room itself, but the kind of room it was, the pre-flood work that had gone on in sealed vaults of its make. The rest of my people read the dark and the cold and the dead grids as one more thing to get through. Marin read it as a thing remembered, and went quiet in the particular way that Veteran went quiet whenever the dissent turned up a truth that had been decided against setting down. I marked that quiet and said nothing about it, because Marin talked when Marin was ready, and not a watch sooner, and a man who pushes a half-blind veteran for the lore he is hiding usually gets the wrong lore for his trouble. We went deep into the vault on my eye and Lena's scouting, down past the long ranks of dead cells toward the heart of the place, and the deeper we went, the heavier the engineering grew. The cells got larger and the grids got denser. Each system stopped being the kind that held a sample and became the kind that held a thing big enough to need a vault of its own. And I read the climb and scale as I read everything, a message the builders had left in the architecture itself. You do not wrap a small thing in this much steel. The old city had spent its best work on whatever sat at the bottom of this lab, and it had spent that work keeping the thing inside rather than keeping the world out, which told me the danger down here had never been the flood. What this lab feared had always been its own cargo. At the end of the long descent, the heart of the biovault opened in front of us, and my appraisal eye read it before my people's lights had finished crossing the room. A single containment grid stood in the center of the vault's heart, vast and dark, a cage of stilled fields built on a scale the rest of the lab had only been working up to. Inside it I read a shape, huge and stilled, a generation dead, that the grid had been built around rather than built to hold. The thing in the grid was no sample. It was the reason the vault existed, and the grid that caged it was dead the same as everything else down here, its fields gone dark a generation ago, which meant the only thing keeping that huge dead shape in its cage was inertia and the hope that nothing ever woke it. My eye read the grid down to its dead nodes, and the reading handed me the one fact that turned a puzzle into a problem. The containment grid was not a single broken thing I could pour charge into blind, the way I had taken the lock. It was a chain, a sequence of nodes that had to come back in a precise order, each one keying the next, and the order was not a thing the lab had left written anywhere I could find. A grid like that fed its fields in sequence, and a sequence run wrong did not simply fail to close the cage. Run wrong, my eye told me. It would do the opposite of what the builders meant, dropping the fields it should raise and raising the ones it should drop. The huge dead shape the old city had spent its best steel to keep caged would come loose into a sealed vault with my people in it, and no door left open at our backs. Someone was already at the grid when we reached it, and my appraisal eye read him before his light found us. A man crouched at the base of the containment chain with a salvager's kit spread open around him, working a dead node by hand, and the reading told me three things at once about Cho Wanjai before he had said a word. He carried a repair talent of his own, a real one, weaker than my Menforge but the genuine article, the first restorer I had crossed since the Wake who was not a fraud running a charm. The man had been down here a long while, dazed by the wear on his kit and the hollow in his face, and he was losing, badly, to the exact problem my eye had just handed me the shape of, the keyed order the grid demanded that he could not see. He stood when our lights crossed him, and the look he turned on me was the look I had been collecting off survivors since the concourse, the one that carried a name in the chat and a sneer behind it. The man knew me already. Word of the junk man had reached even someone who had walked off the net's map days before me, and Cho Wanjai had spent some of his long hours down here deciding what he thought of me. His mind was made up. He told me plainly what he had come down for, that a real scholar of pre-flood restoration had descended ahead of the crowds to do work the dabblers could not, and that he had not expected the layer's only other visitor to be the Spire's most famous fraud. Now here the junk man stood in his vault, at his grid reading the lock he had failed to crack. I did not argue with him, because arguing with someone's opinion of you is a poor trade against simply being right in front of him. Instead I asked him about it, what he had found, how far he had gotten, and he answered me with the wary half-honesty of a competitor who cannot decide whether I am a rival or an idiot. He had worked this puzzle for 3 days. In that time he had restored 2 of its dead nodes by hand, slow careful work that cost him most of what his talent could spend in a watch, and the chain had not so much as flickered, because a sequence half done in the wrong order is a sequence not done at all. The trouble was that he had no way to read the order. His talent could mend a node, but it could not tell him which node came next, and the lab had left that order written nowhere a hand could find it. That was the whole gap between us, and I saw it the moment he laid it out. Cho had the hands and not the eyes. He could restore a node near enough as well as I could, but he worked it blind all the same, guessing his way and burning days proving each guess wrong while my appraisal eye had pulled the whole order off the dead grid the instant I walked up to it. I knew which node keyed which and the exact order the lab had fed the fields in, written in the architecture for anyone who could read architecture. And I had it in the time it took Cho to tell me he could not. The competition he wanted, restorer against restorer, was already over, and the only question left was whether I told him so gently or let the result tell him for me. I made him an offer instead of a point, because whoever beats a rival into the floor wins a fight and loses a hand. And down a layer no one can see I needed hands more than I needed to be read out loud. My offer was simple. I could see the order he could not, my talent running to reading where his ran to mending, and that between his hands and my eye this cage would come back online, this watch where it had cost him 3 days to get nowhere. He did not believe me, because days of failing alone in a dead lab had worn the belief out of him, and he wanted proof before he spent another node on a stranger's say-so. so I gave him the cheapest proof I own. To settle it, I named the exact order of the 2 nodes he had already restored, which he knew and I could not have known unless my eye truly saw into that grid. And I watched the disbelief go out of his face. We worked it together after that, and the work showed both of us the thing the chat had spent 2 layers refusing to believe. I called the steps off my reading, node by node, and Cho restored the first one I pointed him to. It took him near everything he had, the dead node coming back under his hands slow and costly, his talent spending itself down to the floor on a single restore. When it keyed home, he sat back gray and emptied. 1 node done and the chain still long. Then I put my hand on the next node in the sequence and restored it a grade above where its makers had set it, and the whole of what it cost me was a pour of charge I would not miss by the next watch. 1 node had hollowed Cho out, the same work done better, barely touched my reservoir. Cho Wanjai watched the difference land with the particular silence of someone whose whole opinion of you is rearranging itself in real time. He said it before I had finished the 3rd node, honest in the way scholars sometimes are when the evidence stops leaving them room. A man who had come down to expose a fraud was watching that fraud solve in 1 watch the puzzle that had beaten him for 3 days, restoring nodes a grade above his best while spending a fraction of what 1 cost him. So he told me plainly that he had been wrong, that whatever the upper layers called me the talent doing this work was no trick, and that he had never in his life seen a restore run this clean or this deep. It was not flattery because Cho did not have flattery in him. This was a scholar reading a result he could not argue with, and saying it out loud, and someone who admits he was wrong that cleanly is worth keeping. So I kept him. I let him do the work he could while I did the work only I could, and that was the shape our alliance took inside the hour. There were nodes in the sequence I could have restored alone, but a man who spends all of his own charge on a layer no one can see is a man with nothing left for the door at the bottom. And Cho's hands let me bank mine. He took the cheap nodes, the ones a careful restorer could manage without bleeding dry, while I held the order in my head and took the hard ones, the keyed nodes where a wrong restorer would drop the wrong field. Between us, the grid came back faster than either alone, his hands sparing my charge, my eyes sparing his guesses. And a rivalry that had walked in with a sneer turned into a working line because the dead lad did not care which of us had been laughed at on the surface. The chain woke node by node as we worked it down, and I watched the dead grid come back to life in the order the builders had meant, fields rising where they should rise, the cage drawing itself closed around the huge stilled shape at its center. Cho understood what we were doing better than I had said aloud, and somewhere in the last nodes he asked the question a scholar would ask, why a lab would build a cage this deep and key it this hard around a single dead thing. I gave him the honest half of the answer, that you do not spend this much steel in sequence on a corpse unless the corpse is the most dangerous thing you own, and that the builders had clearly feared the day this exact grid failed. Cho went quiet at that, because he had spent 3 days trying to make the cage work without once asking what it was for. We restored the last node together, and the containment chain closed the way the builders had drawn it, every field rising in its keyed order until the cage stood whole again around its cargo, for the first time in a generation. The grid did not seal the thing away, and that was the part Cho and I had both missed until the chain ran complete and showed us its true shape. A containment grid built to this depth was never only a cage, it was a control. And run in the right order, it did not lock the cargo down, but woke it under hold. Brought the huge stilled shape back online inside fields strong enough to govern what they had restored. The cage opened onto the vault's true heart as the last field rose. Inside it stood no monster waiting to be killed. My appraisal eye read it whole in that moment. What it gave me was not a danger to put down, but a guardian to bring back. The lab's apex construct. Dead a generation, waiting at the bottom of the deepest vault on the spire for a hand that could restore it. My appraisal eye read the apex construct down to its dead core before my hand had crossed the last field. The reading told me what the builders had spent their best steel to keep, a bioconstruct raised as the lab's own guardian, engineered before the flood to hold this vault against whatever the old city feared more than the sea. It stood 3 times the height of Sioha's war drone and twice the bulk, a thing of grown plate and fused bone that had been alive in the way the lab made things alive, and it had died under hold a generation ago with its core stilled rather than broken. That was the whole of why the grid had keyed so hard, because the cage had not been built to keep the construct in, but built to keep it asleep. The old city wanting its guardian on a leash it could drop at need, and the morning the world broke that leash it stilled with everything else. I read the death of it and found the same engineered break I had found in every dead thing down here, a core powered down clean rather than rotted through. A guardian set to sleep and never woken. The Menforge did not need the construct's whole history to know it was dead, and it did not need to be told that a thing this size was the most dangerous restorer I had ever set my hand to. I weighed it as I weigh every break, for what it cost against what it bought, and the sum came back near what I had half known it would since the cage showed me its cargo. A guardian this size, restored a tier above the day it died, was the strongest creature any descender on the spire could field, and it sat here under hold, waiting for the one talent that could bring it back. Cho watched me read it and went still. He had spent 3 days believing the thing at the bottom was a monster to survive. I had read it as mine to raise. Even so, I did not pour charge into it blind as I had taken the door. A door run wrong stays shut, and a guardian run wrong wakes hostile in the sealed vault with my people at its feet. So I read the construct's core to its dead nodes before I spent a single charge, and my eye gave me the binding order as it had given me the grid. Before this, I had done a bound restore only on the war drone. Small work against this. A machine leashed to my hand at the moment its power came back, so that it woke knowing whose it was. The construct was no machine, and the leash had to be deeper, set into the living core as the field rose, so that the guardian came up bound to me as it had once been bound to the city that grew it. I held the order in my head, put my hand flat to the stilled core, and let the restore find the death in it as it found every death. By the fact of the break and not the story, the charge it took would have hollowed Cho to the floor and left him gray for a watch. It ran out of my reservoir as a long steady pour I felt to the bottom of my reserve, and yet did not empty, because the mend forge had grown with every layer and a guardian was only the largest thing it had yet been asked to mend. The dead core came back a tier above the day the old city had set it, every grown plate knitting whole, the fused bone driving back to true, the stilled fields of the cage feeding the binding hone as the last node keyed. I set the leash into the core at the moment its power crossed back into the living. The guardian woke bound. 3 days Cho had spent surviving the thought of this thing. It came up under my pore in the back half of a single watch, opened a core the size of a transit car on me, and read its handler in the first beat it was alive. The huge head turned, found me, and held. My strongest creature stood restored above its maker's peak and leashed to me, and the vault that had been built to cage it now held a guardian that answered to the junk man. Lena let out a low whistle from the dark at the edge of the field, the diver's grin riding it, the first sound any of my people had made since the cage opened. She told the dark, loud enough for me to hear and not loud enough to call it a compliment, that she had scouted 3 layers of monsters to kill and the junk man had gone and made the biggest one a pet. The grin stayed on her face after the words ran out. Seoha had her hand on the war drone's anchor and did not move it, but the ex-soldier's red of the room shifted in front of me from a captain bracing for a fight to a captain counting a new gun, and that guarded recalculation was worth more from Seoha than a cheer from anyone else. Suyang came up to my shoulder with the core still in her arms and looked at the thing I had raised with the respect a salvage engineer keeps for a hull that should not float and does, a respect that had stopped being grudging 2 layers ago. Nayoon said nothing, only moved her wounded span closer to the guardian's feet, now that the cage answered to us, and the quiet trust in that small repositioning was the medic's whole thanks. None of them said a word about a fraud. The chat's name for me had no purchase in a room where my hand had just restored the thing the old world feared most. I had not finished reading the construct when its restored core gave me the thing I had not asked for. A guardian raised to govern a vault carried the vault's memory in its core as the war drone had carried its last orders. And the restore that brought the construct back brought back what it had last held before the city set it to sleep. The memory played behind my eye as I held the binding, and for a long beat I was not in a drowned lab at the bottom of the spire, but in the world that lab had been built in. Before the sea, I read the pre-flood city bright and dry, towers standing where the tombs now drowned, the concourse a living market under open sky, the spire a city and not a grave. The construct had stood guard over all of it, and then the memory turned to the morning it ended, and the system flagged what the core showed me, because what came down on the bright city was no active sea or quake. What the memory gave me was the drowning as the guardian had witnessed it, and it had not been an accident. I watched figures move at the edges of the dying city, and my appraisal eye reached for them and got a name off the core's own record where my own readings had only ever found blanks. The unmakers, the ones the transit log had named before the system buried it. They had come to the bright city on purpose and they had sunk it on purpose, opened the deeps under Drownspire and brought the sea up into a world that had no flood in its making. And the guardian had been set to sleep before it could stand against them. The city had not drowned. It had been drowned on purpose. A hand had wanted it under the water, and the guardian's core had held the proof of it through a generation of dark, waiting for a restorer to read it. The deep heart of the vault had more than the guardian in it, and my eye found the rest now that the cage answered to me. Set into the floor behind where the construct had slept was a relic the builders had sealed deeper than the guardian itself, and my appraisal eye read it whole, a pre-flood stronghold restore keyed to district scale. The kind of work that did not mend a door or a drone but a whole holding at once. It sat dead the same as everything down here, waiting on a hand that could spend the charge it asked, and what it offered turned a sealed vault into a fortress in waiting. Beside it, the lab had cached a men-charged tier-up, a pre-flood store that raised the ceiling of what my reservoir could hold and spend, the difference between mending a guardian and mending a city. I drew the tier up first, and my eye read the changeland as the cap on my reservoir climbed past anything the upper layers had ever let me carry, a deeper well to feed a heavier pour. The stronghold restore I left dead for now, because a relic that big spent at the wrong moment was charged thrown into a holding I did not yet want to anchor, and a man who fortifies before he has chosen his ground fortifies the wrong ground. I read both and banked both in the same beat, because the vault that had cost me a drown layer to reach had just handed me the means to fortify a district, and the charge to run it. With all of it held at once, the bound guardian and the relic and the proof of a deliberate drowning, the memory in the construct's core played its last beat before it stilled. In the dying bright city at the edge of the deeps the Unmakers had opened, one of the figures stopped. It had been moving with the others through the drowning the guardian witnessed, and now it turned, slow and deliberate, away from the work of sinking a world, and toward the eye that watched the memory. My appraisal eye read the face as it read every danger, and for the first time since the wake, the system did not give me a blank or a name buried in a log. It gave me a flag, sharp and immediate, set on the figure that had turned, the Tidewright, an unmaker, the hand that had opened the deeps under Drownspire. The face in the generation dead memory turned toward me and held. Under the name, the flag the system raised carried one fact. A restorer had reached the biovault. The Tidewright knew, and it knew because it was looking back. The Guardian held the vault behind us, and for the first watch since the wake, I let the team rest in a dry room I had read clean, which gave old Marin the thing the veteran had been waiting for, a quiet deep enough to set down a truth that had been carried too long. Marin came to me where I sat with the construct's memory still settling behind my eye, sat down across the dead grid with the slowness of the half-blind, and started to talk in the low, even way of someone who had decided the time for hiding was finally past. The old salvager had known this kind of vault, had known what the figures in the memory were before my eye had ever flagged the name, and had spent every layer above choosing not to say it because the truth was the kind that made people stop descending, and a person who stops descending on Drownspire drowns where they stand. What Marin told me, slow and even across that grid, was the shape behind everything I had been reading in pieces since the concourse. The flood had been deliberate, the same as the Guardian's memory had shown me, but the deliberation went deeper than one drowned city. No accident of malice sank one world for the Unmakers. They sank worlds on purpose and by pattern, choosing the ones that had restored themselves too far, the ones whose people had built too high and mended too well, and pushed their making past whatever line the Unmakers drew. And when a world crossed that line, the Unmakers came up out of the deeps and brought the sea with them. Drownspire had been such a world, one that had built high, mended well, climbed too far past the line, and the Tidewright had opened the deeps under it and pulled it down for the crossing. I sat with that and did not interrupt, because the old salvager had more and was finally spending it. And a truth told slow is a truth told whole. The drowning was only the first half of the work. Its second half was the descent itself, the layers and the net and the rank board that tracked every survivor down toward the hollow deep. And it was the half nobody on the spire understood for what it was. Marin named it plainly. The descent was a culling, feeding us the chat and the board and the rank. The system was not a thing the survivors had inherited from the dead city. It belonged to the Unmakers, and it had been built to do to people exactly what the flood had done to the city, to sort the strong from the weak and feed the strongest down the layers toward the deeps where the Unmakers waited. That was the part that turned my stomach over, and I made the old veteran say it twice to be sure I had it true. The rank board did not track us so that we could measure ourselves against each other. It tracked us so the hollow deep could see which of us was worth taking. Every layer down culled the weak and concentrated the strong. Every restored creature and salvaged relic pushing a survivor higher up the board, and the higher a survivor climbed, the more surely the descent was feeding that survivor down toward the bottom as the choicest part of the harvest. The corrupted cores that flowed down toward the dark were not waste running off the layers. They were the yield, the made strength of a drowned world drained down the spire to the hands that had drowned it, and the strongest survivors were the richest part of that yield. The system was never our tool, but the Unmaker's harvest, and we had been climbing the board to make ourselves worth reaping. I held all of it against everything my own eye had read down 5 layers, and found that it fit, every blank and every flag falling into the shape Marin had finally named. And then I understood the one piece the old salvager had not yet said, and maybe did not fully know. My men forged did not fit this harvest, because everything the Unmakers had built ran one direction, toward unmaking the flood, unmaking the city, the descent unmaking the survivors, the corrupted cores carrying the unmade strength down to the dark. Against all of it, my talent ran the other way. Restore was not salvage and it was not making. It was the exact reverse of unmaking, a thing that took what had been broken and drove it back past whole, and a harvest built to unmake a world had no place in its design for a hand that could put the unmade back. I was not a richer part of the yield, but the opposite of the yield. Restoration set against unmaking at the root, and the harvest had no answer for me because it had never been built to be opposed. A machine that sorts the strong to be eaten has a slot for every strong thing it can name, and the strongest climbers fall down those slots one after another toward the dark that waits to take them. What the machine did not have was a slot for a hand that could reach into the eaten and pull it whole again. I did not yet know what that gap was worth, only that it was real. That was why the system had flagged me where it left everyone else unread, and why my own stats stayed hidden from my own eye while it read every other survivor down to the bone. The harvest could not catalog a thing that worked against it. The same as my appraisal eye could not read the pre-flood lock because the system had no entry for what came before the break. I sat outside the design entirely. That was why the Tidewright had turned in a generation dead memory to look at the eye that watched it. Why the flag had carried my reaching of the biovault is a fact the Unmaker already knew. The deeps were not coming for me because I had climbed the board. Those strong climbers the descent fed down where the harvest working is built. I was something else entirely, a restorer reaching the places the Unmakers had sealed, reading the truths they had drowned, and the Tidewright was coming for me by name because of it. Marin watched me reach the end of it and saw that I had gotten there, and the old veteran's relief at not having to say that last part out loud told me the salvager had known it for some time and dreaded the saying. I did not thank Marin for the telling, and Marin did not want thanking. What the old salvager wanted was for me to understand the size of what I was, which was not a survivor who had gotten strong, but a thing the architecture of the whole drowning had no slot for, and to understand it before the tide right reached me rather than after. I understood it well enough. Sitting in the dry vault with my guardian holding the dark, I turned the whole shape of it over once more. Where another man might have felt the size of the thing settle on him as fear, I felt it settle as a tool, the one advantage a harvest this thorough had left lying on the table. So I did the practical thing with the knowledge before I let myself sit any longer in the weight of it. The deep heart of the vault still held relics my eye had banked and not yet drawn, and now that I knew what I was set against, I read them again for the one I had passed over. It was a small pre-flood device sealed beside the stronghold restore. Dead the same as everything down here, that my appraisal eye had flagged before only as a curiosity. Read against the truth Marin had given me, it was no curiosity. It was a counter, a pre-flood working built to hold off on making for a short span. The kind of thing the dead city must have raised in its last watches when it understood what was coming up out of the deeps. I restored it quietly, a grade above its making, while the team rested and Marin looked away, and the device came back small and cold in my hand, a single brief stand against the thing that drowned worlds. It would hold off on making for the length of one short breath, and no longer, which read as nothing against a power that sank whole cities, and yet one breath in the right instant was the difference between a hand undone and a hand still able to restore. I told no one I had it, keeping it back from Marin, from Suyon, from all the rest, because a counter to unmaking was the one card the Tidewright would not expect a restorer to hold, and a card the Deeps did not know about, was the only kind worth keeping against a thing that read me by name. We moved for the next descent when the team had rested, down toward the shaft that dropped below the biovault toward the brinehold layer. And as we crossed back under the reach of the public map, the net found me again at the lip of the drop. The descent rank board, blind to me through the whole of the sealed vault, caught my marker the instant I stepped back into its range, and updated all at once, every layer of standing I had banked off the map landing on the board in a single jump. My rank crossed into the top 10 of the entire descent. I read the board fill-in around my marker and read, in the same beat, the 2 moves that number set off above me, because a top 10 descender drew eyes that a junk man never had. The brinehold moved on me, Prefect Halden's hand reaching down to take a rank that outclimbed his own claim on the layers below, and the Saltbound moved on me, the Flood Cult turning toward a restorer who had reached a sealed vault and come back stronger, the 2 factions converging on the same man for opposite reasons, one to seize what I was, and one to drown it. I read both threats off the net before either could reach me, which was the whole advantage a man pays for by reading where others only fight, and the board told me their shapes in the beat after my rank crossed the top 10. The brinehold came as a column, Prefect Halden's people moving down the spire in good order with the hoarded gear of a faction that had ruled the upper layers since the wake, coming to seize a descender who outclimbed their claim. Behind them the Saltbound came as a tide, the Flood Cult spreading down the routes in the loose deadly swarm of believers fed by an unmaker, coming to drown or restore their drowned god wanted unmade. 2 factions converging on the same shaft, one to own me and one to end me, and the net carried both their movements to me span by span, while neither of them could see one step into the sealed vault at my back. I did not move to meet either, choosing instead to read them, plan against both, and spend the watch I had on the one move that answered them at once. The deep heart of the vault still held the stronghold restore I had banked and left dead, and now I had both the ground and the reason to spend it. For the holding to anchor I had the biovault antechamber, a wide sealed chamber below the reach of the public map, with 1 shaft down and 1 drowned door up, the kind of ground that took a faction a long bleed to force and gave the defender every advantage of knowing it first. I read the dead relic to its core, held the district scale order in my head the way I had held the Guardian's binding, put my hand to it and let the restore find the death in a working built to mend not a door or a drone, but a whole holding at once. This was the largest pour the Mendforge had ever asked of me, larger than the Guardian, and the tear up I had drawn in the vault was the only reason my reservoir could feed it without running dry in the middle of the work. The charge ran out of me in a long deep pour I felt to the floor of a reservoir I had only just deepened, and the antechamber came back around us, a holding restored a grade above the day the dead city had raised it. Dead power lines broke down the chamber walls and carried charge again. Still defense fields rose along the one shaft, and the drowned door, keyed now to my hand the same as the Guardian was keyed. Sealed armories the lab had left dead opened on restored locks, and gave up pre-flood gear my people had no business carrying this far down the spire. The biovault antechamber stopped being a dry room I had read clean and became a powered fortress holding, walls that carried charge, fields that answered me, a shaft no column forced cheap, and a door no tide drowned fast. I read the holding settle into its restored shape and read in the same beat what it cost the 2 factions racing toward me. Neither of them could build. The brinehold had only what it had hoarded since the wake, kept gear and old keeps it carried down the spire and could not add to, and the Saltbound had only the bodies its drowned god fed it. Both came to me with full hands and no way to fill them further, while I had just raised a fortress out of dead stone on a layer they could not see. That was the whole of the gap, and it was the same gap that had run under every layer since the concourse, between a man who could restore the world he stood in, and factions who could only spend the world they had looted. I had turned the bottom of the spire into a stronghold in the back half of one watch, and I had done it to the relic two factions did not know existed. My people armed themselves out of the woken armories while the fields rose around them, and I watched the holding change what my team was the same as the Guardian had changed it. Seoha took the restored defense gear and read the fields and the shaft in the door with the eye of a captain who had just been handed a fortress to hold, and the ex-soldier's guarded thaw of 2 layers turned, for the first time, into something near trust. Suyeon ran the woken power lines with the salvage engineer's hunger for a system that finally had charge in it. Nayoon moved the wounded into the deepest fielded corner, where no force could reach them, and the medic's relief at a wall she could finally count on did the work 1,000 words would not. Lena set herself at the shaft mouth as a scout eye with restored gear in her hands, and the grin riding her face, telling the chamber that the junk man had gone and built a city to lose 2 armies in. The armed refugees took the gear and the fields, and stopped being people I was dragging down to drowning and became a garrison. Before the Saltbound did, the Brinehold reached the upper edge of my fields, and the first thing Prefect Halden's column did was the thing every careful faction does before it forces a holding, which is send a scout ahead to read what it is forcing. I let the scout come down to the lip of the fields and read it as it read me, an appraiser of Halden's own, a talent run to reading the strength of a holding before the column spent blood on it. The scout read my antechamber. I watched it read the woken power lines and the keyed fields and the pre-flood armories, watched it count a holding that outbuilt anything the Brinehold had hoarded in its upper layer keeps, and watched the read land on a face that had come down expecting to price a junkman's hovel. It found a fortress instead. The scout broke off and climbed back to its column to report, and the net carried the report up the spire ahead of it, because a scout's read goes to the board the same as any other. What the scout reported was the thing the chat had spent 5 layers refusing to credit, said now by the Brinehold's own talent, in terms the prefect could not wave off. The Junkman now held a powered fortress at the bottom of the spire that out-fortified anything Brinehold owned. Its charged walls, its keyed fields, its pre-flood armories the envy of a city, raised in a single watch on a layer no faction could even see. Halden's column had come down to seize a descender who outclimbed their claim. The scouts' read told them they had come instead against a man who out-fortified their whole hold, and a column that prices a fight that lopsided does not force the shaft on the first watch. So the Brinehold stopped at the edge of my fields to take counsel. And counsel takes time. And time was the one thing a man who reads faster than he fights spends better than anyone coming for him. The Saltbound did not stop to take counsel, because a tide does not price a wall, and the flood cult reached my upper fields while the Brinehold still weighed its odds. I read the swarm come down the drowned roots toward the door I had restored, shut a watch before. The fields answered them the same as they would answer a column, the door holding, the shaft holding, the whole works doing what it was raised to do while the cult broke against defenses it had nothing hoarded to break. Both threats broke off the same walls at once, a column that would not pay my price and a tide that could not pass my fields, and I held them standing in a fortress the deeps could not see, with a guardian at its heart and a counter to unmaking hidden in my coat. 2 factions had converged to take or end the Junkman. They found a city instead, and the city held. I left the fields to my garrison and the shaft to Seoha, and went alone to the deep heart of the vault, where the guardian held the dark, because a man who has read every threat the net can carry sometimes needs to stand somewhere the net cannot reach and think. Alone with the Guardian, I felt the message come. It opened in my sight the way every system message had opened since the wake, but it came wrong, and my appraisal eye reached for its sender the way it reached for every danger and found, for the first time since the spire woke, a blank where the source should be. The eye that had read the Tide Right's face off a generation-dead memory, that read every survivor on the board down to the bone, that had pulled a faction scout's whole strength off a single glance, could not read who had sent the words now sitting in my sight. Its source was hidden from me. Not buried in a log, not blanked behind a pre-flood seal, but concealed by a hand that knew exactly how my eye read and had shut it out on purpose. I read the message itself, since the sender would not read, and the words were few, and the meaning was one. The order in them was to stop restoring and to come down, carried plain, with one reason set under it that left no room to mistake the sender. I was the only thing it had left to unmake, the single hand on the whole spire it had to put out, and it was the only thing I had ever been made to unmake in turn. The message knew me. It named the Menforge for what it was, the one talent set against the harvest, then named the descent it wanted me to finish, down past the Brinehold layer toward the deeps it had opened a generation ago under a city it drowned on purpose. The Tide Right had reached me by name, in a message my appraisal eye could not source, and that was the part that held me longest in the dark with my guardian, because everything on the spire I could read, and this one thing I could not. I read the message a second time and a third, hunting the source the way I hunt every danger, and each pass returned the same blank where a sender should sit, not absence but concealment, a door shut on purpose by a hand that had measured my eye before it ever wrote to me. The thing that had drowned a world had taken the trouble to learn how I read, and had answered that knowledge before I knew it had begun. An unmaker had found the one hand on the spire it could not abide, and it had sent its word in the one envelope my eye could not open, and nothing I could read told me how it had done either. I stood alone in the dark at the bottom of the spire, A fortress holding above me and a guardian holding beside me, two factions broken on my walls, and a hidden hand naming me from the deeps. And for the first time since the wake I held a question my talent could not answer. I left the order from the deeps unanswered, and took my city down, because a man who answers a thing he cannot read on the day it writes to him, has already started obeying it. And I had a descent to make first. The tide right wanted me to stop restoring and come down. I meant to do the parts that suited me and refuse the parts that suited it, which left me driving down the spire on my own clock with my whole holding at my back, not stripped bare and crawling to a hidden hand as it had asked of me. So I woke the descent engine that I had restored a grade above its dead builder's best, loaded my garrison and the cores and the bound things aboard, then drove the whole works down through the seal that opened onto the layer below. The brine-hold was not a drowned ruin to loot, or a graveyard that walked, and I read that off it before the engine had finished settling on the landing. It was a city that had survived, the first thing on the spire that looked like governance instead of wreckage, a fortified survivor city-state built into a dry layer the flood had spared, with working lights and standing walls and a population that had not spent 5 layers dying. My appraisal eye opened on it, and read order where every layer above had read collapse, courts, ledgers, a chain of command that ran clean from a prefect down through a tax bench to a wall guard holding its posts. The deeps had drowned the world, but they had left this one shelf dry, and on that dry ground a man named Halden had built the nearest thing to a kingdom the spire still held. What that kingdom ran on, my eye read next, and the reading turned my read of the place cold. The brinehold did not farm or salvage or restore. It hoarded, and it taxed, and it had built its whole order on the one thing the layers above it were dying for want of, which was intact working gear that nobody else could make anymore. The dead city's deep stores had ridden out the drowning sealed on the shelf, and Halden's forebears had walked into a vault of pre-flood arsenals and machines that still ran, then built a city-state on the simple arithmetic that whoever owns the last working guns in a drowning world owns everything else by the throat. Descenders who reached this layer paid to pass it. Survivors who sheltered here paid to breathe its dry air. Everyone above the prefect's tax bench paid, and the bench itself paid no one, and that closed loop was the whole engine of the place. The arithmetic was clean. Whoever held the last working guns held everyone who did not, and those who did not paid in everything they had until they had nothing, then paid in service, then paid in their own descent rights. Once even the service ran out, I had read 100 broken things since the wake, and a city built to keep its people poor read no harder than a seized throw or a corroded bearing. It was just bigger. They walked my column to a court before they let me make camp, because a city that taxes descent rights does not let a holding land on its shelf without a reckoning, and the reckoning was public. I took the chamber's measure as they sat me in it, a high court built for show as much as judgment, a tax bench at its head and a gallery packed with the tax-bled survivors the brinehold ran on, with a reckoning board on the back wall that ran the descent rank the same as the net ran it overhead. The gallery had come to watch the bottom shelf city price a fresh column as it priced all of them, and the descent rank on the board had me sitting in the top 10, which is the only reason the prefect himself took the bench instead of a clerk. Men who hold a top 10 descent rank get the prefect. Everyone below it gets a tax table and a clerk who reads it to them. Prefect Halden took the bench and made me the offer he made every strong holding that landed on his shelf, and he made it dressed as mercy. He had read my rank off the board, and my fortress off the report his own scout had carried back to give him, and he knew he could not force a column that outfortified his whole hold, so forcing it was off the table from the start. A vassal deal came in its place. I would bind my men forged to the city's service, restore the city's hoarded arsenals, and run its workshops for its profit, and in exchange the hold would shelter my people on its dry shelf under its standing walls. The price under the offer, set in the soft language a tax bench uses for the things it is taking, was my stronghold and my independence, surrendered up the chain to the prefect's order, my holding folded into his hoard, and my talent folded into his tax loop, until the junkman was one more asset the hold owned by the throat. I read Halden while he spoke, because a man's offer is the thing he says and his position is the thing he is, and the two are rarely the same. My appraisal eye opened on the prefect and read past the bench and the robes and the city behind him into the true state of the hand he was playing, and what it returned was a man bluffing from weakness dressed as strength. Halden did not offer me vassalage because he could take it if I refused. He offered it because he could not, because his standing walls covered a hold that needed a restorer worse than any column that ever landed on his shelf. And the offer was a careful man's first try at getting for a shelter fee the one thing his whole hoard could not buy. The need read clear before its cause did, and the need told me everything the robes were built to hide. A confident man does not lead with a fee dressed as kindness. He leads with that only after weighing his own stores against a column he cannot beat, and finding those stores wanting, then reaching for the one currency a tax bench still holds, when its guns no longer fire, which is the appearance of generosity. Halden was not buying my talent at a rich man's leisure. He was buying it at a drowning man's price, paying in pride for the appearance of paying in nothing, dressing a rescue as a favor he handed down. So I refused him, and I refused him pragmatically in the flat terms used by someone who has read his counterpart's hand and knows the bluff for a bluff. I told the bench I would shelter my own people behind my own walls and pay no fee in independence for dry air I could make myself, and that the hold was welcome to my restoration at a price I set. Paid in trade, with my holding kept whole and my talent kept mine. No voice raised, no threat thrown at the wall guard, because reading a bluff leaves no need of either. Folding a fortress into a horde was simply something I declined to do, and I let the decline sit in the open court, where the whole gallery could hear a top 10 descender tell the prefect to his face that his mercy was a fee and the fee ran too high. The net carried the standoff the moment the court broke, as it carried every reckoning, and the chat carried this one with the city's own tax-bled survivors watching it land. Overhead, the board lit with the read of it, the bottom-shelf city-state that taxed everyone for working gear, made an offer to a top 10 descender, and got told no in open court. A prefect who dressed his shelter fee as mercy, and a junkman who declined to be owned. Up the layers they chewed it as they chewed everything I did, half calling it a fraud's bluster, half finally crediting a holding that could land on a kingdom's shelf and refuse its king to his face. The packed gallery downstairs carried it differently, because the tax-bled survivors who filled that court had spent their lives paying the prefect's loop, and a descender who walked in and declined to pay was a thing they had never once seen done. Above ground the board lit, but down in the gallery the room went quiet, and quiet from a tax-bled crowd carries further than any chat.